Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. I'm glad you're here tonight, wherever you're listening from. Settle in, get comfortable, let the evening go quiet around you. The strangest thing about the East India Company was never its size, though the size alone should stop anyone in their tracks. It was that a private company run by a rotating handful of London merchants who never once set foot in Asia ended up governing more people than the British monarchy itself. It raised armies larger than most European kings could field. It printed its own currency, ran its own courts, waged its own wars, and, when it finally collapsed, took an empire down with it into the hands of the crown. If this kind of history finds something in you, consider subscribing or leaving the channel a like, or sharing it with someone who might want a long, slow story tonight too. And if you'd like to support the work more directly, there's a Patreon link waiting in the description. Tonight's story runs from a royal charter signed under Elizabeth I to a boardroom in London that quietly ran out of purpose 2.5 centuries later. It begins, as most empires do, with something small. Let the history begin. Chapter 1: The Foundation. The story starts not with conquest, but with pepper. By 1600, pepper and other spices from the East Indies moved through so many hands before reaching London that their price had become almost absurd. Portuguese and Spanish traders controlled much of the route already, and the Dutch were racing to lock down the rest. A group of English merchants, watching profits slip past them into foreign hands, decided they wanted a piece of that trade for themselves. On the last day of December in 1600, Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter granting a group of London merchants exclusive English trading rights east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. The document named them the Governor and Company of Merchants of London, trading into the East Indies. Later generations would simply call it the East India Company. 15 years earlier, such a charter would have meant little, since England had no navy capable of enforcing it and no real presence in Asia at all. 218 men subscribed to the original venture, pooling roughly £72,000 between them. This was not the company as later history would remember it, sprawling and militarized. It was, at its founding, closer to a syndicate, merchants betting money on a dangerous voyage, hoping the ships came back loaded rather than lost. Some of the subscribers were seasoned traders from the Levant Company. Others were minor aristocrats looking for a return on idle capital, and a handful were simply gamblers who liked the odds. The structure itself was new for England. Rather than funding one voyage and dissolving afterward, the company operated through a joint stock model that let investors buy shares and spread the risk across many backers at once. A governing body called the Court of Committees, elected annually by the shareholders, managed daily decisions. Elizabeth's charter gave this court broad authority to make its own laws for its own servants abroad, so long as those laws did not conflict with the laws of England. It was a small clause. Nobody in 1600 understood what that clause would eventually grow into. The first fleet left England in February of 1601 under the command of James Lancaster, a veteran of earlier, less successful voyages into Portuguese-controlled waters. 4 ships sailed together, heavily armed against both storms and rival Europeans who might try to intercept them. Lancaster's orders were straightforward: reach the spice-producing regions of the East Indies, trade for pepper, and bring it home intact. The voyage took the better part of 2 years. Lancaster's fleet reached Aceh on the northern tip of Sumatra in mid-1602. There he negotiated with the local sultan for trading rights and loaded his ships with pepper before pushing on toward Bantam on the island of Java. Bantam would become the company's first real foothold in the region, a trading post rather than a colony, staffed by a small number of English merchants living among a much larger Javanese and Chinese trading community. The English were guests there, not rulers, and everyone involved understood the arrangement that way. What the company wanted from Bantam and the surrounding islands was almost entirely pepper, along with smaller quantities of cloves, nutmeg, and mace. These spices were valuable in England for reasons that went beyond simple flavor. Pepper preserved meat, masked the taste of food that was beginning to spoil, and carried a kind of social prestige that made it worth its considerable weight in silver. A single successful cargo could make the difference between a shareholder's ruin and his fortune. Trade on these terms required capital the English did not always have readily available, since Asian merchants generally wanted payment in silver rather than English wool or other manufactured goods. This created a persistent tension inside the company from its earliest years. English silver was flowing east in large quantities to buy spices that would then be sold in Europe, and critics back home worried openly that the kingdom was hemorrhaging precious metal for the sake of pepper and cloth. The company's directors defended the trade as profitable in the long run, and the numbers, when the ships returned safely, tended to prove them right. Returning safely was never guaranteed. Ships were lost to storms in the Indian Ocean, to disease among their crews, and occasionally to outright attack. Scurvy killed sailors on nearly every early voyage before anyone fully understood its cause or its cure. Despite these losses, the early voyages turned enough profit that new subscribers kept coming forward, and the company's charter was renewed and expanded in the years that followed Elizabeth's death. James I, who succeeded Elizabeth in 1603, showed no particular interest in reversing his predecessor's charter. If anything, he leaned into it, granting further trading privileges as the company's voyages proved their worth. The king had his own financial troubles, and a chartered company willing to pay fees and offer loans in exchange for trading monopolies suited him well. Royal favor, though, was never unconditional, and the company understood from its earliest years that its privileges could be revoked as easily as they had been granted. The real obstacle to English ambitions in the East Indies was not the English crown. It was the Dutch. The Dutch East India Company, chartered just 2 years after its English counterpart in 1602, arrived in the same waters with far greater capital, a larger fleet, and a government back home fully willing to back its merchants with military force. Where the English company operated cautiously, the Dutch operated with something closer to state power behind private ambition. This imbalance showed itself quickly around the Spice Islands, where Dutch ships increasingly outnumbered and outgunned their English rivals. English merchants at Bantam and elsewhere found themselves squeezed out of the most lucrative clove and nutmeg markets, forced instead toward pepper, which was more widely available and consequently less profitable. Company directors in London complained bitterly of Dutch harassment, seizures of English ships, and outright violence against English factors. These complaints would only grow louder in the decades that followed, and they were not exaggerated. Still, in these earliest years, the company's ambitions remained narrow by any later standard. There was no talk of ruling territory, collecting taxes, or fielding armies beyond the guards needed to protect a warehouse. Company servants abroad were instructed to trade, not conquer, and to avoid entangling the company in local politics wherever possible. The men running things from London wanted profit delivered quietly and predictably, not the burdens and expenses that came with governing foreign land. That restraint was, in part, simple practicality. The company had neither the money nor the manpower to hold territory against local rulers who could field far larger armies than anything a trading post could muster. Mughal India, Safavid Persia, and the various sultanates of the Indonesian archipelago were wealthy, populous, and militarily formidable in their own right during this period. English merchants operated in these regions on sufferance, granted trading rights by local rulers who saw little threat in a handful of foreigners buying spices and cloth. Nobody, least of all the company itself, imagined this arrangement would ever reverse. By the first decade of the 17th century, the company had established a pattern that would define much of its early existence. Ships sailed out loaded with silver and a small stock of English goods, traded for spices and textiles across a scattered network of factories and trading posts, and returned when they could to sell their cargo in London at a healthy markup. Profits were real but inconsistent, vulnerable to weather, disease, piracy, and Dutch competition in roughly equal measure. Shareholders who wanted steady returns were often disappointed, since individual voyages were still financed and settled separately, rather than through the continuous joint stock structure the company would later adopt. The men who ran the company in these years were, for the most part, unremarkable London merchants doing what merchants everywhere have always done, chasing profit within the limits of what seemed possible. Few of them left much trace in the historical record beyond their names in the company's ledgers and minutes. They were not conquerors, and they gave no early sign of becoming any. History, though, has a way of building slowly toward moments nobody sees coming, and this quiet trading venture would eventually become something its own founders could scarcely have imagined. What mattered most in these earliest years was survival, commercial survival, not military or political. The company needed to prove it could turn a reliable profit before it could hope to attract the steady capital required to compete seriously with the Dutch. That proof came gradually, voyage by voyage, through the 1600s and 1610s, as English trading posts multiplied slowly across the Indian Ocean world. Bantam remained the hub, but factors were soon dispatched to India itself, seeking out ports along its western coast where trade might prove even more lucrative than the contested Spice Islands further east. It was this westward drift, away from a spice trade the Dutch increasingly dominated, and toward the Indian subcontinent instead, that would ultimately reshape the entire trajectory of the company. Nobody planned it as a grand strategy. It emerged instead from a series of smaller, pragmatic decisions made by merchants looking for markets the Dutch had not already claimed. India, in 1600, was simply one option among several for a struggling trading company. Within 2 centuries, it would be the whole of the company's story. Chapter 2: Losing the Spice War. The Dutch did not merely compete with the English in the East Indies. They fought to own the trade outright, and by the 1610s that ambition had hardened into policy. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, a young and ruthlessly effective governor-general for the Dutch East India Company, believed the spice trade should belong to the Dutch alone, with no rivals tolerated anywhere near it. He was not a man given to half measures, and the islands under his control would soon learn exactly what that meant. Cohen's vision took its most brutal form on the Banda Islands, the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew at the time. In 1621, he moved against the Bandanese population with overwhelming force, determined to bring the nutmeg trade under complete Dutch monopoly. Most of the island's inhabitants were killed, enslaved, or driven into exile within the space of a single year. What remained afterward was a plantation system run largely by Dutch settlers and enslaved laborers brought in from elsewhere, producing nutmeg exclusively for Amsterdam's benefit. English merchants watched this campaign with a mixture of horror and helpless frustration, since they had no comparable force to project into the region. The company's directors in London protested through diplomatic channels, appealing to shared Protestant interests and old agreements between the two nations. These appeals accomplished little. Dutch commanders on the ground answered to Batavia and Amsterdam, not to any treaty signed in a European drawing room, and they had both the ships and the will to enforce their claims by violence when persuasion failed. Tensions between the two companies had already been simmering for years before Banda, flaring up repeatedly around smaller trading posts and contested waters. English and Dutch factors sometimes lived and worked within the same towns, competing for the same cargo while nominally at peace back in Europe. This uneasy coexistence produced constant friction, seized ships, disputed contracts, and occasional outright brawls between rival crews. Nowhere would that friction turn more disastrous than at a small trading post called Amboina. Amboina, on the island of Ambon in the Moluccas, hosted both an English and a Dutch trading factory by the early 1620s. In February of 1623, Dutch authorities there arrested a group of English merchants, along with several Japanese mercenaries in company employ, on suspicion of plotting to seize the Dutch fort. The evidence for this alleged conspiracy was thin at best, extracted mostly through torture rather than honest investigation. Even by the standards of the era, the interrogations that followed were brutal. 10 Englishmen were executed at Amboina, beheaded after confessions obtained through methods that included waterboarding and other forms of torture designed to produce whatever answer the interrogators wanted. Among the dead was Gabriel Towerson, the chief English factor at the post, a man with 2 decades of experience trading across the region. News of the executions took months to reach London, carried slowly by ship across 2 oceans. When it finally arrived, the reaction was fury. The Amboina Massacre, as English writers quickly began calling it, became a propaganda weapon almost immediately. Pamphlets circulated describing the tortures in vivid, horrified detail, aimed at stirring public outrage against the Dutch. Company directors demanded compensation and justice from the Dutch authorities, while diplomats argued the matter at the highest levels of both governments. Actual restitution, when it eventually came decades later, proved token and unsatisfying, arriving only after prolonged negotiation and several further rounds of war between England and the Dutch Republic. What mattered more than any formal settlement was the practical effect Amboina had on English strategy in the region. The massacre confirmed what English merchants had already begun to suspect, that competing directly with the Dutch for the Spice Islands was a losing proposition, backed by insufficient force and inadequate political will from London. Continuing to press English claims in the Moluccas and Banda would mean more Amboinas, more executions, more losses absorbed for diminishing returns. The company's leadership began looking elsewhere. India offered an alternative that the Spice Islands no longer did. Unlike the tightly contested archipelago further east, where Dutch power was now close to absolute, the Indian subcontinent remained under the control of a single dominant power, the Mughal Empire, which showed little interest in monopolizing foreign trade the way the Dutch did in the Spice Islands. Mughal rulers were generally happy to grant trading privileges to whichever European merchants offered useful goods, favorable terms, or occasional gifts and loans. This openness created an opportunity the company had been slow to fully exploit. English factors had already established a presence at Surat, on India's western coast, as early as 1608, though for years it remained a secondary post compared to Bantam and the spice trade further east. Surat sat within the territory of the Mughal Empire, then at the height of its wealth and power under successive emperors who controlled a population and an economy that dwarfed anything England could claim. Trading rights there had to be negotiated carefully, with due deference paid to Mughal authority, since the English held no leverage to demand anything by force. As Dutch dominance over the Spice Islands hardened through the 1620s, Surat and the broader Indian trade took on a new importance the company had not originally planned for. Textiles, particularly cotton cloth, proved to be in enormous demand back in Europe, offering profits that in some years rivaled or exceeded what spices had once promised. Indian weavers produced cloth of a quality and variety that English manufacturers could not match, and the company found itself increasingly in the business of buying finished goods rather than raw spices. This shift would prove far more consequential than anyone realized at the time. The pivot toward India was not instantaneous, nor was it a clean break from the spice trade altogether. Company ships continued sailing toward the East Indies for pepper well into the 1620s and beyond, since pepper remained profitable even where cloves and nutmeg had become effectively closed to English merchants. What changed was the center of gravity. Where Bantam had once been the company's most important outpost, Surat and the Indian mainland were steadily becoming its future, even if few of its directors would have described it in such terms at the time. Losing the Spice War carried a bitter taste that lingered in company correspondence for decades afterward. English writers continued invoking Amboina as proof of Dutch treachery long after the practical rivalry had faded into irrelevance, using it almost as a founding grievance for later conflicts between the two nations. 3 separate Anglo-Dutch wars would follow across the 17th century, fought largely over trade and naval supremacy rather than territory in Asia itself. By then, though, the company's own fortunes had already begun moving in a different direction entirely. There is a kind of accidental logic to how empires often begin, and the company's turn toward India was very much of that kind. Nobody in London sat down in the 1620s and decided that India would become the center of an eventual colonial empire. The decision was forced, in large part, by defeat elsewhere, by Dutch cannons at Banda, by Dutch executioners at Amboina, by a rival company simply better funded and more ruthlessly organized than the English one. Necessity, more than ambition, redirected 2 centuries of history toward the Indian subcontinent. What the company carried with it into India, though, was hard experience. It had learned, at considerable cost, what happened when a European trading company held enough force to impose its will on a weaker position. It had watched Cohen turn a monopoly ambition into mass killing at Banda, and it had lost its own men to torture and execution at Amboina for daring to compete too closely with Dutch interests. These were not abstract lessons. They would return, in different form, once the company itself grew powerful enough in India to face the same temptations the Dutch had faced in the Spice Islands, and, in time, it would not resist them any better than the Dutch had. For now, in the 1620s and 1630s, such a reversal remained almost unimaginable. The company that limped away from the Spice Islands was still a modest trading concern, chastened by Dutch power and searching for firmer footing on Indian shores. Its servants at Surat dealt with Mughal officials as supplicants, not as equals, let alone as future rulers. That imbalance would hold for well over a century yet, but the direction of travel, away from the Spice Islands, deeper into the Indian mainland, had now been set, and there would be no going back. Chapter 3: Gaining a Foothold in India. Surat, in the early 17th century, was already one of the busiest ports on the western coast of India, its harbor crowded with ships from Persia, Arabia, and further afield long before an English vessel ever anchored there. The city belonged to the Mughal Empire, then ruled by Jahangir, the son of the great Akbar, and a man who governed one of the wealthiest states on earth. English merchants arriving at Surat were not dealing with some minor local chieftain who might be pressured or bought off. They were dealing with the outer edge of an empire that could, if it chose, crush their ambitions without much effort at all. Getting a foothold there required patience the company had not always shown elsewhere. Early English attempts to trade at Surat, beginning around 1608, met resistance from Portuguese merchants already established in the region, who saw no reason to welcome a new rival into waters they had long treated as their own. Portuguese ships harassed English vessels approaching the coast, and Mughal officials, wary of provoking a fight they didn't need, were slow to grant the English formal trading rights. It took a combination of naval victory and diplomatic persistence to change that calculation. That naval victory came in 1612, when an English fleet under Thomas Best defeated a larger Portuguese force off the coast near Surat. The battle was not overwhelming, but it was enough to demonstrate that English ships could hold their own against Portuguese power in Indian waters. Mughal officials who valued naval strength as a hedge against Portuguese domination of the coast took notice. Within months, Jahangir's court granted the English company permission to establish a trading post at Surat, the first formal foothold the company would hold on the Indian mainland. Establishing the post was one matter, securing it against future uncertainty was another entirely. The company understood that royal favor could be withdrawn as easily as it was granted, and that a single trading concession, however useful, offered little protection against a change of heart at court. What the company wanted was something firmer, a formal embassy, backed by the authority of the English crown itself, that might secure broader and more durable trading privileges across Mughal territory. James I agreed to send one. Sir Thomas Roe arrived at the Mughal court in 1615, carrying the title of ambassador and instructions to negotiate terms favorable to English trade throughout Jahangir's dominions. Roe spent nearly 4 years attached to the itinerant Mughal court, following Jahangir's household as it moved across northern India, learning the elaborate protocols and patient diplomacy that access to Mughal power required. He was not always comfortable in the role. Roe complained frequently in his letters home about the expense, the delays, and the difficulty of extracting firm commitments from a court that operated by very different rules than anything he had known in London. Jahangir, for his part, seems to have found Roe's company genuinely entertaining, even as he remained largely indifferent to the broader commercial concerns the ambassador represented. The emperor was fond of curiosities, of foreign gifts, of conversation with visitors from distant lands, and Roe provided a steady supply of all three. Their relationship, recorded in some detail in Roe's own journals, was cordial without ever becoming truly consequential in Jahangir's eyes. India's economy, after all, did not depend on English trade in any meaningful way. It was the English who needed access, not the Mughals who needed English goods. What Roe eventually secured, after years of patient maneuvering, was not a single grand treaty, but a set of firmans, imperial orders, granting the company protection and trading rights at Surat and eventually at other ports along the coast. These firmans could be renewed, contested, or ignored depending on the local Mughal official in charge, and company factors soon learned that a document from the emperor's court was only as good as the willingness of nearby administrators to honor it. Still, it was a foundation, and the company built on it steadily over the following decades. Surat became the company's principal base in India, its president effectively serving as the senior English official on the subcontinent. From Surat, English trade slowly expanded outward along both coasts of India. Cotton textiles, produced by weavers across Gujarat and further south, proved to be extraordinarily profitable in European markets, arriving in patterns and qualities that no English mill could replicate. Indigo, saltpeter used in gunpowder manufacture, and raw silk added further to the company's growing trade in Indian goods. What had begun as a spice trading venture was steadily transforming into something closer to a general trading house, dealing in whatever Indian markets could produce and European markets would buy. By the 1630s and 1640s, the company had begun establishing additional posts further south and east, seeking better access to different regional markets and hedging against the risks of relying too heavily on any single port. In 1639, company officials negotiated the right to build a fortified settlement at a fishing village on India's southeastern coast, a place that would grow into the city of Madras. This was a different kind of arrangement than Surat had been, smaller in scale initially, but notable for the degree of local autonomy it granted the company, including permission to build a fort and govern the settlement's own affairs. Fort St. George, as the fortification at Madras came to be known, represented an early and still modest step towards something the company had generally avoided until then: direct territorial control, however limited. The local ruler who granted the concession, a minor regional chief rather than a Mughal governor, had less to lose by allowing the English this degree of independence than a more powerful authority might have. For the company, the fort offered security against pirates and rival Europeans that an open trading post could never provide. Neither side, in 1639, imagined this small fortified town as the seed of anything larger. Bombay arrived under very different circumstances a few decades later, acquired not through negotiation with an Indian ruler, but as part of a royal dowry. When Charles II married the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza in 1661, the marriage settlement included the transfer of Bombay, then a modest and somewhat unhealthy set of islands, from Portuguese to English control. Charles, uninterested in managing a distant and unprofitable possession, leased Bombay to the East India Company in 1668 for a nominal annual rent. The company, initially unenthusiastic about the acquisition, would eventually transform it into one of its most important western outposts. Calcutta's founding, further east along the Ganges Delta, came later still, established in 1690 by an English merchant named Job Charnock at a spot he judged suitable for trade despite its notoriously unhealthy climate. Charnock had spent years navigating the complexities of Mughal Bengal, a region governed at the time by officials who answered to the emperor in distant Delhi, but who exercised considerable independence in practice. The site he chose offered good access to river trade and reasonable defensibility, even if the surrounding marshland made it a breeding ground for disease that would kill company servants in appalling numbers for generations. Calcutta grew slowly at first, overshadowed by older and better established ports. Together, Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta formed the four pillars on which the company's Indian presence would eventually rest, though nothing about their early histories suggested the scale they would later achieve. Each began as a negotiated concession granted by rulers who saw the English as useful but subordinate, trading partners to be tolerated, not political actors to be feared. Mughal power, still formidable through most of the 17th century, ensured that the company's ambitions remained tightly bounded by what local and imperial authorities were willing to permit. The company's own internal culture during these decades reflected this position of studied deference. Factors were instructed repeatedly to avoid antagonizing local rulers, to pay whatever fees and offer whatever gifts were expected, and to remember always that they operated in India by permission rather than by right. Company records from the period are full of complaints about the cost of maintaining good relations with Mughal officials, about bribes disguised as customary gifts, and about the constant uncertainty of doing business under a foreign sovereign's changeable goodwill. This was not the language of an organization planning conquest. It was the language of guests trying not to overstay their welcome. And yet the pattern being established during these years, fortified settlements, a degree of self-governance within them, a growing web of trade connecting multiple Indian ports to London, would prove more consequential than anyone recognized at the time. Fort St. George's garrison, however small, was still a garrison. Bombay's lease, however nominal its rent, still gave the company sovereign-like authority over island territory. These were modest facts in isolation, easily dismissed as the ordinary business of a chartered trading company operating abroad. Strung together across a century, though, they would form the scaffolding on which something far larger than trade would eventually be built. By the close of the 17th century, the company held a network of posts stretching from Gujarat in the west to Bengal in the east, trading in textiles, indigo, saltpeter, and a shrinking share of the spices that had once been its entire purpose. Mughal power remained, on paper, unchallenged across the subcontinent, and company officials continued addressing Mughal authorities with the careful deference such power demanded. Beneath that deference, though, conditions were beginning to shift in ways that would soon test how long such an arrangement could hold. The empire that had once seemed unshakable was entering a period of strain, and a company that had spent a century learning how to survive on Indian terms was about to discover it might not need to keep doing so forever. Chapter 4: A company becomes an army. The Mughal Empire that had granted the company its early concessions did not remain the formidable power it had once been. Aurangzeb, the last of the great Mughal emperors, died in 1707 after a long reign spent largely in costly military campaigns across the Deccan. His death opened a period of succession disputes, regional fragmentation, and steadily weakening central authority that historians would later call the empire's slow unraveling. Provincial governors began behaving more like independent rulers than imperial servants, and the emperor in Delhi found his writ shrinking with each passing decade. For the East India Company, this fragmentation created both danger and opportunity in roughly equal measure. Danger, because a weakened Mughal state meant less protection against local disorder, banditry, and the ambitions of newly assertive regional powers. Opportunity, because those same regional powers, no longer answerable to a strong center, were increasingly willing to negotiate directly with European trading companies for money, arms, and military support. The company's factors in India watched this shift closely, uncertain at first how much it might come to matter. Into this unsettled landscape came a rival that would prove far more dangerous to English interests than the Mughals ever had. The French Compagnie des Indes, chartered decades after its English counterpart, had spent the early 18th century building its own network of trading posts along the Indian coast, most importantly at Pondicherry, south of Madras. For years, the two companies coexisted with the same wary tolerance the English had once extended to the Portuguese, competing commercially while generally avoiding open conflict. That tolerance would not survive the ambitions of one particular French governor. Joseph Francois Dupleix arrived as governor of Pondicherry in 1742, bringing with him a vision of French power in India that went well beyond ordinary trade. Dupleix understood, earlier and more clearly than most of his English counterparts, that the collapsing Mughal order offered European companies a chance to become political and military players in their own right, not merely tenants operating at the sufferance of local rulers. He began cultivating relationships with regional princes, offering French troops and expertise in exchange for influence, revenue, and territorial concessions. It was a strategy built on ambition few Europeans in India had yet dared to pursue so openly. The opportunity to test this strategy arrived through a conflict that had little directly to do with India at all. When war broke out between Britain and France in Europe in 1740, part of a broader continental struggle known as the War of the Austrian Succession, the rivalry inevitably spilled over into their respective Indian trading colonies. Dupleix moved quickly, capturing Madras from the English in 1746 with French naval support, a stunning blow to company prestige in the region. The town was eventually returned to English control through the peace treaty that ended the European War, but the episode had demonstrated something unsettling: that European trading companies in India could now fight and win wars against one another using force projected from their own coastal strongholds. What followed was not peace, but a shift into a new and more dangerous kind of competition, one that increasingly ran through Indian political conflicts rather than around them. The Carnatic region of southeastern India, nominally subject to a local Nawab, but riven by succession disputes among rival claimants, became the primary arena. Dupleix threw French support behind one claimant to the Nawab's throne, while the English company, recognizing the stakes, backed a rival candidate of their own. What had begun as commercial rivalry was transforming into something closer to proxy warfare, fought with Indian soldiers and Indian political legitimacy as the currency of victory. It was during this period that a young company clerk named Robert Clive first revealed the military instincts that would later make him famous. Clive had arrived in India in 1744 as an ordinary writer, a low-ranking administrative clerk with no formal military training and, by his own later accounts, a restless and difficult temperament ill-suited to bookkeeping. The chaos of the Carnatic conflicts gave him an outlet his desk work never could. He transferred into the company's small military forces and quickly distinguished himself through a combination of aggression, tactical improvisation, and a willingness to take risks that more cautious officers avoided. Clive's defining early moment came at Arcot in 1751, the capital of the Carnatic and a target he seized in a bold stroke meant to relieve pressure on the English-backed claimant elsewhere in the region. With a small force of roughly 200 European soldiers and 300 Indian sepoys, he captured the lightly defended city and then held it through a siege of nearly 2 months against a vastly larger besieging force. The defense of Arcot became legend almost immediately, celebrated in London as proof that English arms, however outnumbered, could prevail against seemingly hopeless odds. It also marked Clive as a rising figure within the company's military establishment, one whose reputation would only grow in the years that followed. The Carnatic Wars, As this extended period of conflict came to be known, dragged on through the late 1740s and into the 1750s, shifting in fortune between the two companies and their respective Indian allies. Neither side achieved a decisive, lasting victory in the field, but the cumulative effect of the fighting was to entrench both English and French forces more deeply into the region's political structures than either had originally intended. Sepoy armies, trained and drilled along European lines, but recruited overwhelmingly from the local population, grew larger on both sides as the conflict continued. What had started as a handful of guards protecting a trading post had become, within little more than a decade, something resembling a standing army. This transformation did not happen through any grand strategic plan approved in London or Paris. It happened piecemeal, decision by decision, as each company found itself needing just a few more soldiers to hold what it had already won, or to protect an ally whose loyalty had become commercially or politically valuable. Company directors back in England, still thinking primarily in terms of trade balances and dividend payments, were often startled by the mounting military expenses their servants in India were accumulating. Some questioned whether this drift toward armed conflict served the company's true interests at all, but by the time such questions were seriously raised, the momentum was already difficult to reverse. Dupleix, for his part, pushed the logic of political intervention further than the English initially matched, securing not just influence, but formal titles and revenue rights from the Indian rulers he supported. He styled himself, in correspondence and in practice, as something close to a kingmaker across the Carnatic and beyond, a European governor wielding power that rivaled or exceeded that of many regional Indian princes. His ambitions unsettled not only the English, but eventually his own superiors back in Paris, who grew wary of the costs and risks his expansive strategy demanded. French company directors, no less profit-focused than their English counterparts, began to see Dupleix's political adventures as an expensive distraction from the trade that was supposed to justify the whole enterprise. That growing unease in Paris would eventually cost Dupleix his position, but not before the pattern he had pioneered took firm root on both sides of the rivalry. European companies in India had discovered that political intervention, backed by disciplined sepoy armies and a handful of European officers, could yield returns that ordinary trade never could: revenue rights, territorial control, and leverage over rulers who might otherwise resist commercial demands. Clive and his English counterparts absorbed this lesson as thoroughly as Dupleix himself had taught it, even as they fought against the man who first demonstrated its power. The tools of empire, once picked up, proved difficult to set back down. By the mid-1750s, the English company's position in southern India had strengthened considerably relative to its French rival, aided by naval reinforcements from Britain and by a series of English victories that gradually eroded French-backed claimants' hold on power. Dupleix was recalled to France in 1754, his grand ambitions judged by his own superiors to have cost more than they had gained. His departure did not end the underlying rivalry between the two companies, but it did mark a turning point in which English fortunes in the Carnatic began to outpace French ones more consistently than before. What remained after Dupleix's fall was a company fundamentally different from the one that had first landed cautious traders at Surat a century and a half earlier. It now maintained standing military forces, employed European officers whose entire careers revolved around warfare rather than commerce, and had learned through hard experience how to intervene in Indian succession disputes for its own benefit. Sepoy regiments, recruited locally but organized and drilled in European fashion, formed the backbone of this new military capacity, cheaper to maintain than European troops, and available in numbers no purely commercial venture could otherwise have afforded. The company that would soon face its greatest test in Bengal was no longer merely a trading house that happened to keep a few guards. It was in every practical sense that mattered, becoming an army that happened to also trade. Clive himself returned briefly to England in 1753, his health strained by years in India and his reputation considerably enhanced by Arcot and the campaigns that followed it. He would not stay away long. The Carnatic had made his name, but it was Bengal, richer and more consequential than the contested southern coastline, that would make his fortune and, in doing so, permanently alter the course of Indian history. Nobody watching Clive depart for England in 1753 could have fully anticipated what awaited him upon his return, nor how thoroughly the events of the next few years would reshape the company he served. Chapter 5, Plassey, 1757. Bengal, in the middle of the 18th century, was among the richest provinces in the entire Mughal domain, its fertile delta producing textiles, rice, and revenue that far outstripped what the contested Carnatic coast could offer. The company had operated at Calcutta for decades by this point, trading under privileges granted by successive Bengal Nawabs who governed the province with substantial independence from a Mughal center, too weak to enforce much control. Calcutta had grown into a genuine town, walled and fortified after a fashion, its warehouses filled with goods bound for Europe. That prosperity and the fortification that guarded it would soon draw the attention of a new and suspicious ruler. Siraj-ud-Dawla became Nawab of Bengal in 1756, inheriting the position from his grandfather at a young age, and inheriting, along with it, a court riddled with rivals who doubted his fitness to rule. He was, by most contemporary accounts, quick-tempered and deeply insecure about his authority, traits that made him particularly wary of the growing military presence the English and French had established within his territory. When he learned that company officials at Calcutta had continued strengthening their fortifications, despite his explicit objections, he took it as a direct challenge to his sovereignty. It was not, in truth, an unreasonable interpretation. In June of 1756, Siraj marched on Calcutta with a large army and captured the town with little serious resistance from its garrison. Company officials fled in disarray, and a number of English prisoners were confined overnight in a small, poorly ventilated cell within the fort, an episode that would later be remembered and considerably exaggerated in the retelling as the Black Hole of Calcutta. Many of those confined died before morning from suffocation and heat, a genuine tragedy that English propagandists would nonetheless inflate into a symbol of Bengali barbarity used to justify whatever followed. The true numbers involved remain disputed among historians to this day, but the political effect back among the English in India was immediate and furious. News of Calcutta's fall reached Madras by autumn, and the company's leadership there resolved on a forceful response. Robert Clive recently returned to India and, eager to restore his reputation after a disappointing stretch in England, was given command of an expedition to retake the city and punish the Nawab who had seized it. He sailed north with a modest force of company troops, accompanied by naval support under Admiral Charles Watson, determined to reverse the humiliation Calcutta's loss represented. Clive recaptured the city with relative ease in January of 1757, the Nawab's garrison offering only token resistance against disciplined company forces. Retaking Calcutta, though, was only the opening move in a much larger and more consequential drama that Clive now found himself drawn into. Siraj-ud-Dowlah's rule remained deeply unpopular among powerful figures at his own court, several of whom had long resented his elevation and doubted his competence to govern. Chief among these disaffected nobles was Mir Jafar, a senior military commander whose ambitions for the nawabship of his own had been thwarted by Siraj's succession. Clive, ever alert to opportunity, recognized in this discontent a chance to achieve through conspiracy what might otherwise require years of costly warfare. Negotiations between Clive and Mir Jafar proceeded through the spring of 1757, conducted with considerable secrecy and mediated by intermediaries who moved carefully between the English camp and the disaffected Bengali nobility. The terms that emerged were straightforward in their essentials. Mir Jafar would abandon Siraj during any battle with the English, allowing Clive's forces to defeat the Nawab's much larger army, in exchange for which Mir Jafar would be installed as the new Nawab of Bengal. Substantial payments to Clive personally and to the company more broadly were also woven into the arrangement, a detail that would later trouble Clive's conscience, or at least his public reputation, for the rest of his life. It was, in essence, a plot to purchase a kingdom through betrayal rather than win it through combat. The battle that supposedly decided all of this took place on the 23rd of June, 1757, near a village called Plassey, on the banks of the Bhagirathi River north of Calcutta. Siraj's army, numbering somewhere in the tens of thousands, vastly outnumbered Clive's force of roughly 3,000 men, a mix of European soldiers and company sepoys. On paper, the engagement should have been a straightforward and overwhelming Bengali victory. In practice, the conspiracy already arranged with Mir Jafar meant the battle's true outcome had been settled well before either army fired a shot. Fighting began in the morning under heavy monsoon rain, conditions that damaged much of Siraj's artillery powder, while Clive's forces, better prepared for the weather, kept their own supplies dry beneath tarpaulins. As the day wore on, Mir Jafar's division, along with several other contingents privy to the conspiracy, held back from serious engagement, refusing orders to advance against the English lines. Siraj, watching his army's cohesion collapse around him without understanding the full extent of the betrayal, panicked as reports of defection multiplied. By late afternoon, his forces were in full retreat, and what had begun as a battle ended as something closer to a rout engineered well in advance. Casualties on the English side numbered only a few dozen, a strikingly small toll for an engagement that would prove so consequential. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled the field in the chaos, attempting to escape towards safer territory, but he was captured within days by agents loyal to Mir Jafar and executed shortly afterward on the new Nawab's orders. Mir Jafar was installed as Nawab of Bengal within weeks of the battle, exactly as the secret arrangement with Clive had promised, and the province's vast wealth now lay open to company influence in ways it never had before. What had been achieved was less a military conquest than a coup, dressed afterward in the language of a great battlefield triumph. The rewards that flowed to Clive personally in the aftermath were extraordinary by any standard, drawn from the Bengali treasury as part of the price Mir Jafar paid for his throne. Clive received a jagir, a grant of land revenue, worth an enormous annual income, along with direct cash payments that made him one of the wealthiest Englishmen of his generation almost overnight. Other company officials and officers involved in the conspiracy received substantial payments of their own, a practice that would later be described, with considerable justice, as looting dressed up as diplomacy. The distinction between company profit and personal enrichment, always somewhat blurred in company affairs, effectively dissolved altogether in the aftermath of Plassey. What Plassey actually represented, beneath the mythology that would later surround it in British imperial memory, was less a triumph of arms than a demonstration of how thoroughly the company had learned to exploit Indian political weakness for its own advantage. The battle itself, brief and lightly contested, decided almost nothing through combat. The conspiracy with Mir Jafar had decided everything beforehand. Clive understood this perfectly well, even as later British writers transformed Plassey into a legend of martial genius and heroic daring against impossible odds. He had not defeated an army so much as purchased one's betrayal, a distinction that mattered enormously to how the event should be understood, even if it mattered less to how it was subsequently celebrated. Mir Jafar's position as Nawab, meanwhile, proved considerably less comfortable than he might have anticipated when he first entered into conspiracy with Clive. He found himself Nawab in name only, dependent on company military support to hold his throne, and increasingly squeezed by company demands for money, favorable trading terms, and further concessions that eroded whatever independent authority the title was supposed to carry. Bengal's treasury, already strained by the payments made after Plassey, could not sustain the company's continuing appetite for revenue. Within a few years, Mir Jafar himself would be discarded by the very allies who had installed him, replaced by another puppet Nawab when his usefulness to company interests had run its course. This pattern, established so clearly in Bengal after 1757, would recur again and again across Indian territory in the decades that followed. A local ruler, weakened by succession disputes or internal rivals, would accept company military support in exchange for concessions that steadily eroded his own authority. The ruler would then find himself dependent, indebted, and eventually expendable, replaced whenever the company judged a more compliant figure useful. Plassey was not simply a single battle won through treachery. It was the template for an entire method of conquest, one that would extend company control across vast stretches of the subcontinent over the following century, without always requiring the open warfare that conquest traditionally implied. Back in London, news of Plassey and Bengal's effective subjugation arrived to considerable celebration. understood at the time primarily as a triumph over French influence and a vindication of Clive's military genius. Few in England grasped, at least initially, the full implications of what had actually occurred, that a chartered trading company had effectively become the arbiter of who ruled one of the wealthiest provinces in Asia. Clive returned to England in 1760 as a wealthy and celebrated figure, his name now inseparable from the company's transformation from trading concern into territorial power. Bengal's revenues, and the question of who would ultimately control them, would occupy company politics for years to come. What Plassey set in motion, in the end, extended well beyond Mir Jafar's brief and uneasy reign, or Clive's personal fortune, considerable as that fortune was. It marked the moment the company crossed a threshold from which there was, in practice, no real return, from a trading house that occasionally intervened in local politics to a power that now effectively controlled the succession of an entire province's rulers. The revenues of Bengal, richer than anything the company had previously touched, now beckoned as a resource to be extracted rather than merely traded for. That extraction and the famine and administrative upheaval it would help produce within a decade formed the darker inheritance of a victory still remembered in the mythology the company itself helped construct as a moment of glory. Chapter 6: The Diwani and the Bengal Famine. Mir Jafar's usefulness to the company did not last long once the immediate celebrations of Plassey had faded. He proved unable to keep pace with the mounting financial demands company officials placed on him, his treasury drained by the payments already made and by the continuing expectation of further tribute. Within a few years, company leadership in Bengal judged him too weak and too indebted to remain useful as a puppet ruler. In 1760, they replaced him with his son-in-law Mir Qasim, a more capable administrator who nonetheless soon discovered the same trap that had consumed his predecessor. Mir Qasim, unlike Mir Jafar, attempted to resist company encroachment rather than simply accommodate it, reorganizing his administration and even relocating his capital in an effort to govern with greater independence. His resistance culminated in open conflict, a war fought between his forces and the company through 1763 and into 1764, ending in decisive defeat for the Nawab at the Battle of Buxar. Buxar proved in some ways even more consequential than Plassey had been 7 years earlier, since it combined the forces of the deposed Mir Qasim with those of the Mughal emperor himself and the Nawab of neighboring Awadh, all defeated together by a comparatively modest company army. The victory left the company facing remarkably little organized resistance anywhere in northern India. It was in the aftermath of Buxar that Clive, returning to India for a second term as governor in 1765, negotiated an arrangement that would transform the company's relationship to Bengal more thoroughly than Plassey ever had. The Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, defeated and largely powerless, granted the company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, the formal right to collect revenue across these provinces on the emperor's behalf. This was not conquest in any conventional sense, since the company continued acknowledging Mughal sovereignty in name and paid the emperor a fixed annual tribute in return. In practical terms, though, the company had just become the effective ruler of one of the richest regions in Asia, with legal cover provided by an emperor too weak to refuse. What made the Diwani so consequential was the peculiar structure it created, one that Clive himself would later be criticized for having designed with insufficient care. The company now held the right to collect and keep Bengal's revenue, yet it declined to take on direct responsibility for the province's day-to-day administration, leaving that burden with Indian officials who continued operating under the Nawab's nominal authority. This arrangement, sometimes called dual government, meant that power and responsibility had become separated in a way that served nobody well. The company extracted revenue without accountability for how that extraction affected the people who paid it, while the nominal administrators retained responsibility without the resources or authority to govern effectively. Revenue collection under the new system intensified rapidly, driven by company officials eager to maximize returns for shareholders and by their own personal ambitions for profit, since many combined their official duties with private trading interests of considerable scale. Tax demands on Bengali peasants and landholders rose sharply in the years immediately following the Diwani grant, extracted with a rigor that took little account of harvest conditions or local capacity to pay. Traditional systems of famine relief, which earlier Mughal administrations had sometimes provided during periods of poor harvest, received no equivalent attention from a company administration focused overwhelmingly on maximizing revenue flow back to Calcutta and, ultimately, to London. The stage for catastrophe was set well before the catastrophe itself arrived. The monsoon failed across Bengal in 1769 and failed again the following year, producing successive harvests far below what the region needed to sustain its population. Famine spread rapidly through the countryside as grain stores dwindled and prices climbed beyond what ordinary people could afford. Company records from the period describe scenes of extraordinary suffering, starving families abandoning their villages in search of food, roads littered with the dead and dying, entire communities emptied as survivors fled towards cities that offered no real relief either. This was the Bengal famine of 1770, among the deadliest famines in recorded history up to that point. Estimates of the death toll vary considerably among historians, but even conservative figures suggest that roughly a third of Bengal's population, perhaps 10 million people or more, died over the course of the famine's worst years. What makes this catastrophe particularly damning in retrospect is not simply its scale, but the company's conduct throughout it. Rather than easing revenue demands to account for the crisis, company officials in several districts continued collecting taxes at rates close to pre-famine levels, extracting payment from a population that was starving to death in front of them. Some officials even profited directly from the crisis, buying grain cheaply and reselling it at inflated prices as scarcity worsened. Warren Hastings, who would rise to prominence as governor of Bengal in the years immediately following the famine, later acknowledged in his own correspondence that revenue collection had continued with insufficient regard for the human catastrophe unfolding around it. He was not present in Bengal during the famine's very worst months, having only recently assumed his position, but he inherited an administrative culture that had demonstrated its priorities clearly enough already. Reforms he introduced afterward attempted to separate revenue collection from some of its worst excesses, though critics both then and since have questioned how meaningfully those reforms address the underlying structure that had produced the disaster in the first place. News of the famine's scale eventually reached London, though it took considerable time and produced far less alarm among company directors and shareholders than the scale of the tragedy might seem to warrant. Company profits and dividend payments, remarkably, continued through the famine years, a fact that later became a source of considerable scandal once fuller accounts of the disaster became public knowledge in Britain. Parliament would eventually take notice, though meaningful reform of company practices in Bengal remained years away, arriving only after further scandals and further suffering had accumulated in the intervening period. The gap between what company officials in India experienced and what shareholders in London understood proved, throughout this period, dangerously wide. The famine's demographic and economic damage to Bengal extended for decades beyond the disaster's immediate years, as agricultural production struggled to recover and entire regions remained depopulated long after the worst of the starvation had passed. Fields that had once supported dense populations of farmers lay abandoned, their cultivators dead or scattered, while the company's revenue demands on the survivors often continued largely undiminished. Bengal, once among the most prosperous provinces of the Mughal world, entered a period of prolonged economic hardship directly traceable to both the natural disaster of failed monsoons and the administrative choices that turned that disaster into mass death. It would be generations before the province's population and agricultural capacity fully recovered. What the Diwani and the famine together revealed, with a clarity that shocked even some contemporaries in Britain, was the fundamental problem embedded in the company's new role. A commercial organization structured around the goal of maximizing profit for its shareholders had assumed the governing responsibilities of a sovereign state without adopting any of the obligations that legitimate governance was traditionally understood to carry. There was no equivalent within company structures of a ruler's duty to protect subjects from starvation, no institutional mechanism that prioritized human welfare over quarterly returns. Critics in Britain increasingly began asking whether a trading company was fit to govern anyone at all, a question that would grow louder as further scandals emerged from India in the years that followed. Clive himself, despite having engineered the Diwani arrangement that set these events in motion, largely escaped direct blame for the famine in contemporary British discourse, his reputation still buoyed by the earlier glories of Plassey and the wealth he had brought home. He would face harsher scrutiny in Parliament a few years later, though on charges related more to personal enrichment than to the famine's staggering human cost. That the architect of dual government faced so little direct accounting for its most catastrophic consequence speaks to how selectively British attention fell on company misconduct during this period, drawn more readily to financial scandal among Englishmen than to mass death among Bengalis. For Bengal itself, the years surrounding the Diwani grant marked a decisive and tragic turning point, the moment when company rule shifted from indirect influence exercised through puppet nawabs into direct administrative and fiscal control, dressed in the thinnest possible legal justification. The Mughal emperor's grant had provided legal cover, but the reality on the ground was straightforward. A private company now held effective sovereignty over tens of millions of people, extracted their wealth with little regard for their survival, and answered to shareholders in London rather than to any authority accountable to the governed themselves. This was the arrangement Clive had built, celebrated in Britain as a triumph of statecraft, even as it produced one of the deadliest famines in human history within its first 5 years. The famine's aftermath would eventually force changes in how the company governed, though those changes came slowly and were driven as much by financial crisis within the company itself as by any moral reckoning over Bengal's suffering. Revenue shortfalls following the famine, combined with mounting military expenses elsewhere in India, would push the company toward a financial crisis by the early 1770s, severe enough to require direct intervention from the British government. That crisis, and the parliamentary scrutiny it invited, would draw figures like Warren Hastings and Edmund Burke into a prolonged struggle over what the company had become and what obligations, if any, it owed to the millions of people now living under its rule. Bengal's famine, in this sense, was not merely a humanitarian catastrophe in its own right. It was the opening chapter in a much longer reckoning over the nature of company power itself. Chapter 7: Warren Hastings and the Machinery of Rule. Warren Hastings arrived in India as a young company writer in 1750. He spent his early career learning Bengali, Persian, and the administrative customs of the region. Most company servants of his generation saw India chiefly as a place to make a fortune and leave. Hastings was different. He developed a genuine scholarly interest in Indian law and literature, an interest that would later shape how he governed. By the time Hastings became governor of Bengal in 1772, company finances were in serious disorder. The famine's aftermath had drained the treasury. Military costs elsewhere kept climbing. Clive's dual government system, which separated revenue collection from actual administration, had proven exactly as dysfunctional as its early critics warned. Hastings moved to dismantle it, pulling both functions under direct company control. Building that kind of control meant creating institutions where almost none had existed before. Hastings established new courts, both civil and criminal. These courts blended English legal principles with existing Hindu and Islamic law, depending on who stood before them. He reorganized tax collection to curb some of the worst abuses of the post-Diwani years. Historians still debate how much this actually protected ordinary farmers. Hastings wanted something beyond efficient tax collection, though. He commissioned translations of Sanskrit and Persian texts. He supported early scholarly institutions devoted to Indian history and culture. He cultivated real relationships with Indian officials and intellectuals, something rare among company men of his time. This engagement earned him respect in certain circles, both Indian and British. None of it shielded him from the storm gathering in Parliament. A growing number of voices in London had started asking whether a trading company should govern a subcontinent with so little oversight. The Regulating Act of 1773 was Parliament's answer. It created the position of Governor-General of Bengal, with authority over the company's other Indian presidencies, and it established a council to check that authority. Hastings became the first Governor-General. The position gave him enormous power. It also placed him directly in the path of intensifying scrutiny from home. His council frequently opposed him. Wars against the Marathas and against Mysore drained company resources on multiple fronts at once, and the money to fight them had to come from somewhere. Some of Hastings' methods for raising that money drew sharp criticism later. He agreed to help an allied Nawab conquer Rohilla territory in northern India in exchange for payment that eased company finances. The campaign was brutal. Reports of its conduct reached Britain and painted Hastings as complicit in cruelty against a people who had posed no real threat to company interests. Equally damaging was his treatment of the begums of Awadh, female relatives of a deceased Nawab who held considerable wealth. Hastings pressured local officials to seize that wealth. Critics called it extortion dressed up as debt collection. Episodes like these would later form the core of the case brought against him. Edmund Burke became Hastings' fiercest critic. Burke had never set foot in India. He studied company conduct there anyway, with an intensity that bordered on obsession through the 1780s. He came to see Hastings not as one flawed man, but as the embodiment of a system that let private profit override every principle of justice. That conviction would drive Burke to pursue impeachment relentlessly. Philip Francis supplied much of the testimony that fed the case in London. He had served on Hastings's own council in Bengal, and the two men despised each other. Their rivalry grew so bitter it ended in an actual duel in 1780. Francis was wounded. He returned to England carrying both the injury and a determination to see Hastings held to account. Hastings returned to England in 1785, having resigned after more than a decade governing Bengal. He expected criticism. He did not expect what was coming. Burke moved for his impeachment in the House of Commons in 1786, laying out charges spanning corruption, extortion, and cruelty across a string of specific episodes. The trial opened in Westminster Hall in 1788. Burke's opening speeches were, by contemporary accounts, among the most powerful oratory Parliament had ever heard. Crowds came to watch. The proceedings quickly became something of a public spectacle, part legal reckoning and part theater. The trial dragged on for 7 years. Witnesses were called from India. Documents piled up. Procedural delays and the sheer scale of the evidence stretched the case far beyond what anyone had expected at the outset. Hastings endured all of it with remarkable composure, insisting throughout that his actions had been necessary responses to genuine crisis. When the trial finally ended in 1795, the House of Lords acquitted him on every charge. The verdict reflected both the difficulty of proving specific allegations in court and a political mood that had shifted considerably since the outrage of the 1780s. Hastings won his freedom, but lost his fortune. Legal costs had consumed nearly everything he owned. He spent his remaining years largely in retirement. His reputation recovered somewhat over time. Historians would keep arguing about the true nature of his conduct in India for generations afterward, and that argument has never fully settled. What the impeachment accomplished went beyond the fate of one man. It forced company conduct in India into sustained public scrutiny for the first time. It established a precedent. Company officials, however powerful abroad, were not entirely beyond reach back home. Burke's principles about what governance owed the governed would shape British thinking on empire for decades, even when those principles were honored more in speeches than in practice. For the company, the whole episode exposed a contradiction that only deepened as its territory kept expanding. It was no longer a simple trading concern answerable to shareholders. It was not, with any real clarity, a legitimate government answerable to the people it ruled either. Hastings had tried to build real institutions while fighting wars and scraping together revenue under constant pressure. His successors would inherit both his institutions and his unresolved contradictions, and further conquest would only stretch those contradictions across more territory still. Chapter 8: The Napoleonic Interlude and Tipu Sultan. Mysore, in the closing decades of the 18th century, stood as one of the few Indian states still capable of meeting company power on genuinely equal terms. Under Hyder Ali and then his son Tipu Sultan, the kingdom had built a modern army, trained artillery corps, and even developed early rocket technology that startled European observers who encountered it in battle. Tipu inherited the throne in 1782 amid ongoing war with the company, a conflict his father had fought with considerable success before his death. He carried that war forward with the same determination, convinced that Mysore's independence depended on resisting company expansion by whatever means necessary. Tipu's ambitions extended well beyond simple military defense. He corresponded with foreign powers across the region and beyond, seeking alliances that might counterbalance growing British influence in India. He modernized his administration along lines partly inspired by European models, while remaining fiercely committed to Mysore's sovereignty and to Islam as a guiding principle of his rule. British officials in Madras and Calcutta regarded him as the single most dangerous obstacle to their ambitions in southern India, a judgment that events would repeatedly confirm over the following 15 years. The wars fought between Mysore and the company during this period were genuinely costly affairs, unlike some of the more one-sided engagements that had characterized company conquest elsewhere. The Second Anglo-Mysore War, running through the early 1780s, ended largely in stalemate, with neither side able to force a decisive conclusion. Tipu's forces demonstrated real tactical sophistication, and company commanders learned to respect an adversary who could match European-style discipline with mobility and local knowledge of the terrain. Peace, when it came, proved temporary, as both sides understood it would. By the 1790s, European politics had begun casting a long shadow over Indian affairs in ways that made Tipu's position considerably more precarious. Revolutionary France, and later Napoleon Bonaparte himself, saw in India an opportunity to strike at British power from an unexpected direction, weakening a rival empire by threatening its most valuable overseas possession. Tipu, eager for allies against the company, opened communications with French representatives, hoping their support might tip the balance decisively in his favor. These overtures, real but ultimately limited in practical effect, gave British officials exactly the pretext they wanted. Lord Wellesley arrived as Governor-General in 1798, bringing with him an aggressive vision of company expansion that differed sharply from the more cautious approach of some predecessors. Wellesley viewed the French connection to Tipu as an intolerable strategic threat, one that justified decisive military action rather than continued negotiation or containment. He began preparing for war against Mysore almost immediately upon assuming office, gathering forces and alliances with a speed that left little doubt about his intentions. Diplomacy, in Wellesley's calculation, had already run its course. Napoleon's own expedition to Egypt in 1798 sharpened British anxieties considerably, since it raised the genuine possibility of a French land route toward India through the Middle East and Persia. British strategists in London and Calcutta took this threat seriously, however remote it may look in hindsight, and Wellesley used it to justify swift, uncompromising action against any Indian ruler who maintained French ties. Tipu Sultan, with his history of French correspondence, became the immediate target of this heightened alarm. The stage was set for a final reckoning between Mysore and the company. War came in 1799, when Wellesley's forces, combined with troops from allied Indian states including the Nizam of Hyderabad, marched on Mysore in overwhelming numbers. Tipu's kingdom, though militarily capable, could not match the combined resources the company now brought to bear. Among the British officers leading this campaign was a young colonel named Arthur Wellesley, the Governor-General's own younger brother, whose performance in this and subsequent Indian campaigns would help build the reputation he later carried into the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, where he would eventually be known as the Duke of Wellington. The decisive engagement came at Seringapatam, Tipu's fortified capital, besieged through the spring of 1799 by company forces determined to end Mysorean independence once and for all. The siege culminated on the 4th of May when British troops stormed the city's defenses after weeks of bombardment had weakened its walls sufficiently. Fighting inside the city was fierce and brief, ending only when Tipu himself, refusing to flee or surrender, was killed defending a gate near the palace. His body was found among the dead, still bearing the wounds of the fighting that had claimed him. Tipu's death effectively ended Mysore's status as an independent power capable of challenging company authority. The kingdom was partitioned in the aftermath, with a significant portion restored to the old Wodeyar dynasty that Tipu's father had originally displaced decades earlier, now ruling as a company client state rather than a sovereign power. Other territories were annexed directly or distributed among company allies who had assisted in the campaign. What remained of Mysore's independence existed only on company terms, a pattern that would repeat itself across numerous Indian states in the years that followed. Seringapatam's fall carried significance in Britain that extended well beyond its immediate strategic value. Tipu had been portrayed for years in British press and popular imagination as a fanatical and cruel enemy, a depiction that mixed genuine grievances with considerable exaggeration and outright propaganda designed to justify his eventual destruction. His death was celebrated across Britain with a fervor usually reserved for victories over major European rivals, and objects looted from his palace, including his famous mechanical tiger mauling a British soldier, became prized curiosities displayed back home. The mythology built around his defeat would outlast any accurate memory of the man himself for generations. Wellesley's broader strategy during these years extended far beyond the single campaign against Mysore, reflecting a governor-general determined to reshape the political map of India according to company interests. He developed what became known as the system of subsidiary alliances, under which Indian rulers accepted company troops stationed within their territory, paid for the privilege, and surrendered control of their foreign relations in exchange for protection against rivals. Numerous states across India entered into these arrangements during Wellesley's tenure, often with little genuine choice given the military pressure the company was prepared to apply against holdouts. The subsidiary alliance system proved remarkably effective at expanding company influence without always requiring the costly, drawn-out warfare that direct conquest demanded. Rulers who accepted these terms retained nominal sovereignty and often considerable local authority over internal affairs, a fact that made the arrangement more palatable than outright annexation might have been. In practice, though, they surrendered the two things that mattered most for genuine independence: control over their own military forces and the ability to conduct foreign policy free from company oversight. Many would find, as Mir Jafar and his successors in Bengal had found decades earlier, that such surrendered independence was difficult to reclaim once lost. Arthur Wellesley's own role in these Indian campaigns extended beyond Seringapatam into further fighting against the Marathas over the following years, experience that shaped his development as a commander long before Waterloo made him famous across Europe. He led forces at the Battle of Assaye in 1803, a hard-fought and costly victory against Maratha armies that he himself later described as among the most difficult engagements of his entire military career, more demanding in some respects than anything he would later face against Napoleon's forces. India, in this sense, served as something of a proving ground for a general whose later reputation would rest primarily on European battlefields. By the time Lord Wellesley's tenure as Governor-General ended in 1805, recalled to London partly over concerns about the expense and aggression of his expansionist policies, the political landscape of India had been transformed substantially from what he had inherited 7 years earlier. Mysore's independent power was gone. Numerous other states had been drawn into subsidiary alliances that left them dependent on company goodwill. The Marathas, still formidable, had suffered serious defeats that weakened their capacity to resist further company expansion in the years ahead. Wellesley's critics in London worried about the costs of this aggressive expansion, but the territorial and strategic gains it produced would prove difficult for his successors to simply abandon. What Tipu Sultan's death and Mysore's fall represented, beyond their immediate consequences, was the elimination of the last Indian power capable of contesting company authority through genuinely modern, European-style military capacity. Other states remained, some quite powerful still, but none combined Tipu's combination of military innovation, administrative modernization, and unyielding determination to resist company encroachment by force. His fall removed a psychological barrier as much as a strategic one, demonstrating to other Indian rulers watching from afar that even a well-armed, well-organized adversary could ultimately be crushed if the company judged the threat serious enough. The Napoleonic shadow that had helped precipitate this final war against Mysore continued to influence company strategy in India for years afterward, even as Napoleon's own ambitions turned increasingly toward Europe rather than any serious effort to reach the subcontinent directly. British officials in India remained watchful for French intrigue among Indian courts throughout the early 19th century, a weariness that occasionally justified further aggressive action against rulers suspected of foreign sympathies. The connection between European great power rivalry and Indian conquest, so clearly visible in Tipu's downfall, would continue shaping company decisions long after the immediate crisis that had triggered Wellesley's campaign had passed into history. Seringapatam's fall in 1799 marked, in retrospect, a genuine turning point in the company's transformation from a powerful regional player into something approaching the dominant authority across the entire subcontinent. Bengal had given the company its wealth. Mysore's defeat removed its most capable military rival. What remained ahead in the opening years of the 19th century was less a question of whether company power would continue expanding than of how far and how fast that expansion would proceed, and what remained of genuine Indian sovereignty would have to contend with an authority that had now demonstrated decisively that even the strongest resistance could eventually be broken. Chapter 9: The Opium Trade. By the early 19th century, the East India Company faced a persistent commercial problem that no amount of territorial conquest in India had managed to solve. Britain wanted enormous quantities of Chinese tea, a trade that had grown into one of the most profitable and dependable branches of company commerce. China, governed by the Qing dynasty under a policy that restricted foreign trade to a single port at Canton, wanted very little that Britain actually produced in return. Silver flowed steadily out of British coffers to pay for tea year after year in a trade imbalance that troubled company accountants considerably. The solution the company settled on was opium, grown under monopoly conditions across large stretches of Bengal and Bihar, territory the company had controlled since the days of Clive and the Diwani grant. Poppy cultivation had existed in the region long before company rule, but the company transformed it into an industrial enterprise, forcing peasant farmers into contracts that obligated them to grow poppies rather than food crops, often at prices that left little room for genuine profit on the farmer's side. The raw opium was processed at company factories, most notably at Patna, and pressed into balls wrapped in poppy leaves for export. This was not incidental trade. It became one of the company's most carefully managed and consistently profitable operations. Selling opium directly into China, however, presented a legal complication that the company chose to navigate rather than confront. Chinese law banned opium imports outright, a restriction the Qing government had maintained with varying degrees of enforcement since the early 18th century. The company's solution was to avoid selling the drug directly, auctioning its opium instead to private British and other traders in Calcutta, who then carried it independently to the Chinese coast for sale through smuggling networks the company could plausibly claim no direct responsibility for. This arrangement let the company profit enormously from opium while maintaining a legal fiction of distance from its illegal sale. The scale of this smuggling grew dramatically through the early decades of the 19th century, expanding from a modest trickle into a flood that Chinese authorities found increasingly impossible to ignore. Opium reached Chinese consumers through a network of corrupt officials, local smugglers and foreign traders operating just outside formal legal channels, often anchored off the coast near Canton in specially built opium clippers designed for speed. Addiction spread widely across Chinese society during these years, affecting people across social classes and regions, from port cities along the coast to communities far inland along the trade routes that opium eventually reached. Qing officials watched this spread with mounting alarm, recognizing both the human toll and the drain on silver reserves as payment for opium reversed the very imbalance that had originally driven Britain to the drug trade. Chinese attempts to suppress the trade proved largely ineffective for decades, undermined by corruption among local officials who profited from allowing smuggling to continue, and by the sheer scale of demand that addiction had created. Periodic crackdowns removed individual smugglers or seized particular shipments, but the underlying network persisted, adapting quickly to whatever enforcement measures the Qing government attempted. By the 1830s, the volume of opium entering China each year had grown to a scale that alarmed even officials who had previously shown little interest in the problem. The silver drain reversed so severely that it began affecting the broader Chinese economy in ways that touched ordinary commerce far removed from the opium trade itself. The Doguang Emperor, increasingly troubled by both the addiction crisis and its economic consequences, eventually appointed a commissioner tasked with ending the opium trade decisively rather than through the piecemeal enforcement that had failed for so long. Lin Zexu, a respected and capable official with a reputation for integrity, arrived at Canton in 1839, carrying explicit imperial authority to act with whatever force the situation required. He moved quickly and without much patience for the diplomatic niceties foreign traders had grown accustomed to receiving. His approach would prove far more consequential than his predecessor's occasional gestures at enforcement. Lin's first major action was to demand that foreign merchants at Canton surrender their entire opium stockpiles, a demand backed by the effective blockade of the foreign trading quarter until compliance was achieved. Charles Elliot, the British Superintendent of Trade at Canton, eventually persuaded the merchants to comply, promising them compensation from the British government for opium they surrendered, a promise that would later have significant political consequences back in London. Over 20,000 chests of opium, representing an enormous quantity of the drug and considerable financial value, were handed over to Chinese authorities through this process. Lin ordered the entire stockpile destroyed publicly at Human, dissolved in trenches filled with water, lime, and salt, before being flushed out to sea over the course of several weeks in June of 1839. This destruction, while a genuine victory for Chinese enforcement efforts against the drug trade, set in motion a chain of events that neither Lin nor the Qing court had fully anticipated. British merchants who had lost their opium stockpiles pressed hard for compensation and for a forceful response against what they characterized as an unjustified seizure of legitimate private property. Elliot's promise of compensation from the British government created a direct financial incentive for London to seek reparations from China, transforming what might have remained a regional trade dispute into a matter of British national interest and honor. Merchants with connections in Parliament lobbied vigorously for military intervention. The British government's decision to pursue war against China rested on a peculiar and, to many contemporaries, as well as later observers, deeply troubling foundation. Britain would fight to defend the interests of merchants engaged in a trade that was illegal under Chinese law and increasingly criticized on moral grounds even within Britain itself. Parliamentary debate over the decision was genuinely contentious, with figures like William Gladstone speaking forcefully against a war fought, in his memorable phrase, to protect a trade that dishonored the nation that pursued it. The vote to proceed with military action nonetheless passed, though narrowly enough to reveal how divided British opinion genuinely was on the matter. What made the case for war persuasive to enough members of Parliament extended beyond opium itself into broader commercial and strategic considerations regarding British access to Chinese markets more generally. Merchants and manufacturers eager for expanded trade with China, unrelated to opium specifically, saw an opportunity in forcing open ports that Qing restrictions had long kept closed to broader British commerce. Military and naval officials, confident in Britain's technological superiority over Chinese forces, viewed the prospect of war with little concern about the eventual outcome. Opium provided the immediate pretext, but the underlying ambitions driving British policy reached considerably further than the drug trade alone. The company itself occupied an increasingly complicated position throughout this unfolding crisis, profiting enormously from opium cultivation and sale, even as it maintained its careful legal distance from the actual smuggling into China. Company monopoly control over opium production in India ensured that whatever profits flowed from the trade, regardless of who carried the drug across the final leg of its journey into Chinese ports, ultimately benefited company revenues substantially. This income had become, by the 1830s, one of the most significant sources of company profit, rivaling or exceeding returns from many of its more conventional trading activities. The war that Lin Zexu's actions helped trigger was, in a very real sense, a war fought partly to protect company revenue streams. However indirectly the company's own hands appeared in the official justifications offered. Opium's centrality to company finances by this period reflected how thoroughly the organization's priorities had shifted since its founding as a spice trading venture over 2 centuries earlier. What had begun with pepper and cloves had passed through textiles and territorial revenue extraction in Bengal, arriving eventually at a drug monopoly that fueled addiction across an entire foreign society for the sake of correcting a trade imbalance. Company directors in London rarely spoke of the opium trade in such stark terms, preferring instead the language of commerce and market access that obscured the human costs accumulating on the Chinese side of the transaction. Distance, both geographic and rhetorical, made this obscuring considerably easier to maintain. Lin Zexu, for his part, attempted diplomatic outreach even as he enforced the destruction of British opium stocks, writing directly to Queen Victoria to appeal to what he hoped might be shared moral principles regarding a trade he considered indefensible on any grounds. His letter argued that Britain itself prohibited opium consumption domestically and asked how a nation that protected its own people from the drug could justify selling it so aggressively to another. The letter, whether or not it ever reached the Queen personally in any meaningful sense, captured the genuine moral clarity with which Lin approached the crisis, a clarity that stood in sharp contrast to the commercial and strategic calculations driving British policy in the opposite direction. By the final months of 1839, incidents of violence between British and Chinese forces around Canton had already begun escalating beyond the initial opium seizure and destruction, foreshadowing the larger conflict that would soon follow. Naval skirmishes near the Pearl River estuary demonstrated the technological gap between British warships and Chinese coastal defenses, a gap that would prove decisive once full-scale war began. Both sides by this point understood that negotiation alone was unlikely to resolve a dispute that had become entangled with questions of trade access, national honor, and sovereignty that neither government seemed willing to simply concede. The opium trade that had built such enormous profits for the company across Bengal's poppy fields was about to trigger a war that would reshape China's relationship with the Western world for a century to come. What the opium trade ultimately revealed about the company in these final years before its own eventual dissolution was the extent to which profit had become entirely detached from any pretense of moral or humanitarian consideration in how the organization conducted its affairs. The famine in Bengal decades earlier had shown a company willing to extract revenue from a starving population. The opium trade showed a company willing to industrialize the production of an addictive drug and profit from its forced sale into a society that had explicitly outlawed it. Both episodes shared a common thread: commercial interest, unconstrained by governance or accountability to the people affected, producing consequences that ranged from catastrophic to genuinely destabilizing for entire nations. The war now approaching would test, in a new arena, just how far the company and the British state behind it were willing to go in defense of that commercial interest. Chapter 10: The First Opium War. War formally began in the summer of 1840, when a British expeditionary force arrived off the Chinese coast, carrying orders to compel the Qing government into a settlement favorable to British trading interests. The fleet, dispatched from India and reinforced by ships from Britain itself, represented a level of naval and military technology that Chinese coastal defenses had never before faced in anything resembling equal terms. Steam-powered warships, unfamiliar and unnerving to Chinese observers, moved independent of wind and tide in ways that traditional junks and shore batteries struggled to counter effectively. What followed would demonstrate with brutal clarity just how wide the technological gap between the two sides had actually become. Rather than attacking Canton directly, where Lin Zexu's defenses and fortifications had been considerably strengthened in anticipation of British retaliation, the expeditionary force sailed north along the coast, seeking softer targets and greater leverage over the imperial court itself. British ships captured Chusan, an island near the mouth of the Yangtze, with minimal resistance, establishing a forward base for further operations. The fleet then continued toward the mouth of the Peiho River, close enough to Beijing that the threat to the capital itself became impossible for Qing officials to ignore any longer. This shift in strategy revealed a clear-eyed British understanding that pressure on the imperial center, rather than punishment of Canton specifically, would produce faster results. The approach worked, at least in the short term, prompting the Qing court to open negotiations rather than risk further humiliation so close to the seat of imperial power. Lin Zexu, whose vigorous enforcement had helped trigger the war in the first place, found himself blamed by the emperor for provoking a conflict that Chinese forces now appeared unable to win. He was stripped of his position and exiled to a remote frontier posting, a fall from grace that reflected how quickly imperial favor could shift when military setbacks demanded a scapegoat. His replacement, more inclined toward accommodation, opened talks with Charles Eliot that produced a preliminary agreement neither government would ultimately honor. That preliminary settlement, negotiated in early 1841, proposed ceding Hong Kong to British control along with compensation for the destroyed opium and expanded trading privileges at Canton. Both governments rejected these terms almost immediately upon review, each judging them either too generous or insufficiently favorable, depending on which side was doing the judging. The British government in London felt Eliot had secured far too little given the military advantage Britain held, and it recalled him in favor of a more aggressive negotiator willing to press for greater concessions. Fighting resumed shortly afterward, this time with considerably less restraint on the British side than the earlier campaign had shown. Henry Pottinger arrived as Eliot's replacement in 1841, carrying instructions to secure a far more comprehensive settlement than his predecessor had managed. Under his direction, British forces launched a renewed offensive that pushed considerably further into Chinese territory than the earlier campaign had attempted. They captured Amoy, then Ningbo, then moved on toward Shanghai, meeting resistance that varied considerably in intensity, but that never came close to halting British advances for long. Chinese forces, brave in many individual engagements, simply lacked the technology and organization to match disciplined troops backed by overwhelming naval firepower. The campaign's climax came in the summer of 1842, when British forces moved against Nanjing, one of China's most historically significant cities and close enough to the vital Grand Canal to threaten the entire empire's internal grain transport system if captured or blockaded. This threat proved decisive in a way that even the earlier approach toward Beijing had not quite achieved, since it struck directly at the logistical foundations that kept much of China fed and functioning. Qing officials, recognizing that further resistance risked catastrophic internal consequences beyond the war itself, finally agreed to negotiate on terms that overwhelmingly favored British demands. The war that had begun over opium was ending in a settlement that extended far beyond the drug trade that had triggered it. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in August of 1842 aboard a British warship anchored near the city, formalized a settlement that would reshape China's relationship with Western powers for the following century. Hong Kong was ceded outright to British control, becoming a colony that would remain under British administration for 150 years. 5 Chinese ports, including Canton and Shanghai, were open to British trade and residence under terms that Qing authorities had no meaningful ability to refuse. China also agreed to pay a substantial indemnity, covering both war costs and compensation for the opium destroyed by Lin Zexu 3 years earlier. What the treaty conspicuously did not address was the underlying question of opium itself, a fact that later observers, both Chinese and Western, would find remarkable given the drug's central role in triggering the entire conflict. No provision in the Treaty of Nanjing legalized the trade explicitly, but none prohibited it either, and the practical effect of the settlement was to leave opium smuggling essentially unimpeded going forward. British merchants continued importing the drug in ever larger quantities through the newly opened ports, now operating with considerably less fear of serious Chinese enforcement than they had faced before the war. The conflict, fought nominally over opium, ended without resolving anything about opium at all. Additional agreements signed in the years immediately following Nanjing extended British privileges further still, establishing what came to be known as extraterritoriality, the principle that British subjects in China would be tried under British rather than Chinese law for crimes committed on Chinese soil. This provision struck at the heart of Chinese sovereignty in ways that went beyond even the territorial and commercial concessions already extracted, effectively placing British citizens beyond the reach of Chinese legal authority within their own country. Other Western powers, watching Britain's success, quickly sought and obtained similar concessions of their own, extending the pattern established at Nanjing across a growing list of nations eager for comparable privileges. For the East India Company specifically, the war's outcome secured and expanded exactly the commercial advantages that its opium monopoly had been designed to protect from the outset. New ports meant new markets for both opium and the broader range of company and British goods now flowing into China with fewer restrictions than ever before. The indemnity payments, while flowing to the British government rather than directly to the company, reflected a war fought substantially in defense of interests the company's opium trade had created and sustained for decades. Company opium production in Bengal, already substantial before the war, expanded further still in the years that followed as Chinese demand continued growing under conditions of reduced enforcement. The human cost of this expanded trade fell overwhelmingly on Chinese society, where addiction rates climbed steadily through the remainder of the 19th century, touching an ever larger share of the population across an ever wider swath of Chinese territory. Estimates of the number of Chinese opium users by the later decades of the century range into the tens of millions, a public health crisis of genuinely staggering proportions that traced its origins directly back to the trade the company had built and the war that had protected it. Qing officials continued periodic efforts at reform and suppression over subsequent decades, but the legal and military framework established at Nanjing made comprehensive enforcement effectively impossible without renewed conflict that China, weakened further by the war's outcome, was in no position to risk. Chinese historical memory would come to regard the First Opium War as the opening chapter of what later writers termed the Century of Humiliation, a period marked by repeated foreign encroachment on Chinese sovereignty that the Nanjing settlement had inaugurated so decisively. This framing, while developed more fully in later generations than among Qing officials living through the war itself, captured something genuine about the conflict's significance. It marked the moment a previously self-contained and largely self-sufficient imperial power was forced open by external military force, its sovereignty compromised in ways that would compound across subsequent decades through further wars and further concessions extracted by other Western nations following Britain's example. Lin Zexu, exiled and disgraced in the war's immediate aftermath, would eventually see his reputation partially restored as later Chinese generations came to view his opposition to opium as principled rather than reckless, a judgment history rendered rather differently than the emperor who had punished him in 1841. He died in 1850, having lived just long enough to watch the trade he had fought so hard to suppress expand further under the very treaty terms his defeat had helped produce. His letter to Queen Victoria, largely ignored or dismissed at the time it was written, would later be read by historians as a clear-eyed moral indictment of a war that few British participants themselves had ever managed to fully justify, even Gladstone, who had opposed it from the floor of Parliament before it began. What the First Opium War ultimately demonstrated, beyond its immediate territorial and commercial outcomes, was the extent to which industrial and military technology had shifted the balance of global power decisively away from societies that had once stood as equals or superiors to European states in wealth and organization. China in 1840 remained, by most measures, a wealthy and populous empire with a long tradition of sophisticated governance and culture. None of that tradition proved capable of matching steam-powered warships and modern artillery when the two systems finally met in direct conflict. The war's outcome would echo through the remainder of the 19th century, not only in China's continuing struggles with foreign powers, but in the broader lesson it offered European empires everywhere that industrial military superiority could overcome almost any disparity in population, wealth, or historical prestige. Back within the company's own structure, the war's successful conclusion coincided with a period of introspection about the organization's future role, even as its commercial fortunes from opium continued climbing. The company that had once been a modest trading venture chasing pepper in the Indonesian archipelago now stood behind a war that had forcibly reshaped China's relationship with the entire Western world. Its administrators in Calcutta and London increasingly resembled the governors of an empire rather than the directors of a trading house, a transformation that had been building for nearly a century and that showed no sign of reversing. The machinery required to administer such an empire, though, was proving an increasingly awkward fit for an organization still nominally structured as a commercial enterprise answerable to shareholders, rather than to the millions of people its decisions now affected across two continents. Chapter 11: Governing an Empire from an Office. By the 1830s and 1840s, the East India Company faced a peculiar administrative challenge that no purely commercial organization had ever confronted at this scale before. It needed officials capable of governing millions of people across an enormous and culturally diverse territory. Yet its traditional method of recruitment, patronage extended by directors to sons of friends and family, had never been designed to produce competent administrators. Company servants arriving in India often possessed little more than a gentleman's education and a director's favor, credentials that had served well enough when the job meant overseeing a trading post, but proved dangerously inadequate for governing provinces. Something more systematic was clearly needed. The company's response was to build an institution unlike anything it had attempted before, a training college dedicated specifically to preparing young men for the work of Indian administration. Haileybury, established in Hertfordshire in 1806, offered a curriculum blending classical education with subjects considered directly useful for colonial governance, including Indian languages, law, history, and political economy. Students spent roughly 2 years there before departing for India, arriving with at least some formal preparation for the responsibilities awaiting them. It was, by the standards of the era, a genuinely unusual experiment in professionalizing what had previously been treated as little more than patronage. Among the figures who shaped Haileybury's intellectual character was Thomas Robert Malthus, the economist whose theories on population had already made him a controversial and widely discussed figure in Britain. Malthus taught political economy at the college for decades, exposing generations of future Indian administrators to his particular views on population, scarcity, and the limits of human welfare under conditions of resource constraint. His presence lent the institution genuine intellectual weight, even as his theories would later be criticized for shaping colonial attitudes toward famine and relief in ways that proved indifferent, or worse, to Indian suffering. Graduates of Haileybury entered a company civil service that had grown increasingly elaborate and hierarchical as territorial responsibilities expanded across the subcontinent. Junior officials, known as writers when the term still carried its original clerical meaning, worked their way upward through a graded system of postings that combined revenue collection, judicial responsibilities, and general administration within districts often larger and more populous than entire English counties. A single district officer might be responsible for tax assessment, criminal justice, and public order across territory containing hundreds of thousands of people, a scope of individual authority almost unimaginable within Britain's own domestic administrative structure. This system produced administrators of genuinely varied quality and temperament, some conscientious and reform-minded, others indifferent or openly contemptuous of the populations they governed. Company records from the period reveal officials who studied Indian languages and legal traditions with real scholarly seriousness, alongside others who barely bothered learning enough of the local tongue to communicate basic instructions. The gap between these two types mattered enormously to the millions of Indians whose daily lives depended on which sort of officer happened to occupy the nearest district post, a fact that company structure did remarkably little to address systematically. Among the figures who left the deepest mark on how this administrative system understood its own purpose was Thomas Babington Macaulay, who arrived in India in 1834 to serve on the Governor-General's Council and to chair a committee on public education. Macaulay brought with him a supreme confidence in the superiority of English literature, language, and learning, convictions he expressed with a bluntness that startled even some of his British contemporaries. His famous Minute on Education, submitted in 1835, argued forcefully that English should replace Sanskrit and Arabic as the primary language of instruction in company-funded schools, on the grounds that English literature simply contained more worthwhile knowledge than anything available in Indian classical languages. Macaulay's Minute did not mince words about the comparative value he assigned to different intellectual traditions, dismissing centuries of Sanskrit and Persian scholarship with a confidence that reflected the era's broader assumptions about European cultural superiority, rather than any genuine engagement with the texts he was so readily discounting. He argued that the company's limited educational resources should be spent creating a class of Indians who were, in his own memorable phrase, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and intellect. This vision would shape company and later colonial educational policy for generations, producing an English-educated Indian elite whose relationship to both British rule and their own cultural inheritance grew increasingly complicated over time. The policy's consequences extended well beyond the classroom, reshaping which Indians gained access to positions within the expanding colonial bureaucracy and which forms of knowledge the company's administrative apparatus recognized as legitimate. English medium education became, over subsequent decades, the primary pathway toward employment within company and later Crown administration, creating powerful incentives for ambitious Indian families to abandon traditional educational institutions in favor of the new English language schools the company increasingly funded. Traditional centers of Sanskrit and Persian learning, once central to Indian intellectual and administrative life, found themselves marginalized within a system now oriented decisively toward a different set of priorities entirely. Beneath the district officers and their broader policy debates sat an enormous apparatus of clerks, translators, tax collectors, and minor officials, the overwhelming majority of them Indian rather than British, without whom company administration simply could not have functioned at the scale it operated. These lower-level positions offered limited prestige and modest pay by comparison with the senior civil service, but they nonetheless represented crucial points of contact between company authority and the millions of ordinary people whose lives that authority touched daily. Historians examining company records have increasingly emphasized how much of the actual work of governance depended on this largely invisible Indian administrative class, whose contributions rarely appear prominently in accounts focused on senior British officials. Revenue administration remained, throughout this period, the single most consequential function the company's bureaucracy performed, since land tax continued providing the overwhelming majority of company income across its Indian territories. Different regions operated under different revenue settlements, some assessing tax directly against individual cultivators, others working through intermediary landlords who collected from tenants and remitted a share upward to company officials. These systems, designed with varying degrees of care and understanding of local agricultural conditions, produced outcomes that ranged from reasonably stable to genuinely destructive, depending heavily on how well a given settlement matched the actual economic realities of the region it governed. The permanent settlement imposed in Bengal in 1793, fixing tax obligations at rates that would never be revised regardless of future agricultural conditions, exemplified both the appeal and the danger of administrative systems designed more for bureaucratic convenience than for genuine understanding of local circumstances. Landlords benefited considerably when harvests improved, since their fixed tax obligation to the company remained unchanged while their own income from tenants could rise freely. When conditions worsened, though, this same fixed structure offered no flexibility, pushing the burden of adjustment entirely onto cultivators who had no comparable protection built into the system. Company administrators in other regions, watching Bengal's experience, adopted different and sometimes more flexible approaches, though none fully escaped the tension between administrative simplicity and responsiveness to actual conditions on the ground. Judicial administration followed a similarly uneven pattern, blending English legal concepts with existing Hindu and Islamic legal traditions in ways that created genuine complexity for anyone attempting to navigate the resulting system. Company courts employed pandits and malvis, scholars of Hindu and Islamic law respectively, to advise British judges on questions of personal law affecting marriage, inheritance, and religious practice, even as criminal law increasingly moved towards standardized codes drafted according to British legal principles. This hybrid arrangement satisfied few observers completely. Indian legal scholars often found their traditional expertise reduced to an advisory role, subordinate to British judicial authority, while British administrators frequently complained about the difficulty of applying consistent standards across such a genuinely pluralistic legal landscape. What emerged from decades of this administrative development was neither a purely commercial enterprise nor a fully coherent colonial state, but something uneasily suspended between the two, staffed by a bureaucracy trained at Haileybury, yet dependent on an enormous Indian workforce, whose contributions the system rarely credited adequately. The company's civil service by the 1840s bore only faint resemblance to the small circle of merchants who had first negotiated trading rights at Surat 2 centuries earlier. It now administered justice, collected taxes, built roads and canals in a limited but growing fashion, and increasingly shaped what knowledge Indian children would be taught in schools the company itself funded and organized. This machinery of governance, whatever its considerable flaws and inconsistencies, gave the company a degree of administrative reach that no earlier Indian power, including the Mughal Empire at its height, had ever quite achieved across such a vast and diverse territory. Standardized revenue assessment, however imperfectly calibrated to local conditions, extended company authority into villages that had operated with considerable autonomy under earlier regimes. A trained cadre of officials, whatever their individual failings, provided continuity and predictability that depended less on the personal character of any single ruler than earlier Indian administrative traditions typically had. This reach, built patiently over decades through Haileybury graduates and their Indian subordinates alike, would prove both the company's greatest institutional achievement and, in the years immediately ahead, one of the deepest sources of the resentment that would eventually erupt against it. Chapter 12: Annexation by Doctrine. James Andrew Brown Ramsay, Lord Dalhousie, arrived in India as Governor-General in 1848, carrying with him a conviction that British administration represented genuine progress over the numerous smaller Indian states still nominally independent under company protection. He was young for the position, energetic, and deeply committed to the idea that consolidated British rule would serve Indian populations better than continued rule by princes he regarded as frequently incompetent, corrupt, or simply obstacles to the modernization he intended to pursue. This conviction would guide policy decisions over the following 8 years that reshaped the map of British India more dramatically than almost any single administrator before him. Dalhousie inherited a subcontinent already substantially transformed by the subsidiary alliance system Wellesley had pioneered decades earlier, a landscape dotted with princely states that retained internal autonomy while surrendering military and foreign policy control to the company. Many of these states functioned reasonably well under their existing rulers, while others suffered from genuine misgovernment, succession disputes, and administrative dysfunction that gave the company periodic pretexts for intervention. Dalhousie, unlike some predecessors who had tolerated this uneven patchwork with relative indifference, saw an opportunity for systematic consolidation rather than case-by-case management. The instrument he chose for this consolidation was a legal principle known as the Doctrine of Lapse, which held that when a ruling prince died without a natural biological heir, his state would pass directly to company control rather than to an adopted successor, regardless of long-established local custom permitting adoption for exactly this purpose. Adoption had functioned for centuries across much of India as an accepted and legally recognized mechanism for maintaining dynastic continuity when a ruler had no biological son. Dalhousie's doctrine simply refused to recognize this practice as valid for the purposes of determining succession to a princely throne, a legal reinterpretation that conveniently served company territorial ambitions. Satara became one of the earliest test cases for this policy, annexed in 1848 after its ruler died without a biological heir, despite having formally adopted a successor according to established practice. Company officials declared the adoption invalid for purposes of state succession and absorbed Satara's territory directly into British administration, brushing aside protests from the deceased ruler's family and from other Indian observers who recognized immediately what the precedent might mean for their own dynasties. The annexation proceeded with minimal resistance, encouraging Dalhousie to apply the same doctrine more broadly across the following years. Jaipur, Sambalpur, and several smaller states followed similar patterns through the early 1850s, each annexation following the same basic template of a childless ruler, an unrecognized adoption, and a straightforward company takeover justified through legal reasoning that Indian observers increasingly recognized as pretext dressed in the language of law. What made the doctrine particularly unsettling to Indian rulers watching these events unfold was its total disregard for how thoroughly it violated customs those rulers had relied upon for generations to secure their own succession. No amount of loyal service to the company, no history of cooperative relations, offered genuine protection against a policy that could simply declare a legitimate heir illegitimate whenever convenient. Jhansi provided perhaps the most consequential application of the doctrine, annexed in 1854 following the death of its ruler, Gangadhar Rao, who had adopted a son shortly before his death, specifically to ensure continuity of his line according to established Hindu practice. His widow, Rani Lakshmibai, petitioned vigorously against the annexation, arguing that the adoption had been conducted with full traditional legitimacy and deserved recognition regardless of company legal doctrine. Dalhousie's administration rejected her appeals and absorbed Jhansi into British territory, a decision that left the young widow stripped of her position and deeply embittered toward the authority that had dismissed her son's claim so casually. Her grievance would resurface with considerable force just a few years later, in circumstances Dalhousie could not have fully anticipated. Beyond the doctrine of lapse itself, Dalhousie pursued annexation through other legal and political mechanisms when circumstances allowed, most significantly in the case of the Punjab, where two wars against the Sikh Empire during the 1840s culminated in outright annexation in 1849, rather than the more indirect method the Doctrine typically employed. The Sikh Empire, built by Ranjit Singh into one of the most formidable military powers in India during his lifetime, had fractured badly following his death in 1839, weakened by succession disputes and internal instability that the company proved willing to exploit through direct military conquest. Punjab's annexation added a large, wealthy, and strategically important territory to company holdings, secured through war rather than legal reinterpretation. Awadh represented Dalhousie's most controversial annexation of all, executed in 1856 through a different justification entirely, one grounded in accusations of persistent misgovernment rather than any question of disputed succession or adoption. The reigning Nawab, Wajid Ali Shah, had ruled a state that remained nominally independent despite decades of company influence over its foreign affairs and military capacity under the subsidiary alliance system established generations earlier. Company officials accused his administration of corruption, financial mismanagement, and general incompetence, charges that carried genuine substance in some respects, but that also served as remarkably convenient justification for territorial absorption Dalhousie had clearly favored, regardless of the specific administrative complaints raised against Wajid Ali Shah's court. The annexation of Awadh proceeded despite the Nawab's demonstrated loyalty to company interests throughout his reign, a loyalty that had included substantial financial and military support during earlier company campaigns elsewhere in India. Wajid Ali Shah was deposed and exiled to Calcutta, his court dissolved and his considerable personal wealth largely absorbed into company administration. What made this annexation particularly consequential, beyond the immediate injustice felt by the deposed Nawab and his court, was Awadh's status as one of the primary recruiting grounds for the company's own sepoy army, meaning that thousands of soldiers in company service suddenly found their home state absorbed and their former ruler humiliated by the very institution they served. This connection between Awadh's annexation and the sepoy army's composition would prove considerably more significant than Dalhousie appears to have anticipated at the time, since soldiers recruited from the region carried news of their former ruler's treatment back to barracks and villages across northern India, feeding a growing sense among many sepoys that company rule showed little genuine respect for Indian institutions, rulers, or traditions, regardless of how loyally those institutions had served British interests. Grievances that might otherwise have remained localized to Awadh instead spread through military channels that connected the state directly to the wider sepoy army stationed across company territory. Dalhousie's consolidation policy, whatever administrative logic underpinned it, was steadily accumulating resentments that extended well beyond the specific rulers and territories directly affected. Dalhousie defended his annexation policy throughout his tenure as a matter of genuine administrative improvement, arguing consistently that company rule offered better governance, greater stability, and more effective infrastructure development than the numerous smaller princely administrations it replaced. He pursued this vision of modernization energetically beyond annexation itself, overseeing significant expansion of India's railway network, telegraph lines, and postal system during his time as Governor-General. These infrastructure projects, genuinely consequential in their own right, reflected Dalhousie's broader conviction that British administration represented technological and institutional progress that justified the political costs his consolidation policies were simultaneously generating. What Dalhousie's critics, both Indian and British, increasingly pointed out was the fundamental contradiction embedded in claiming to modernize India while simultaneously dismantling long-established customs of succession and governance, whenever doing so served company territorial interests. The doctrine of lapse rested on a legal technicality that company administrators applied selectively, invoked against states whose absorption served British interests, while similar questions about succession legitimacy in other contexts received considerably less scrutiny. This selectivity was not lost on Indian rulers and observers, who increasingly viewed the doctrine not as principled legal reasoning, but as a convenient instrument for territorial expansion, dressed in the language of law and administrative improvement. By the time Dalhousie's tenure as Governor General ended in 1856, the cumulative territorial expansion achieved through the doctrine of lapse and related annexation policies had added a substantial portion of the Indian subcontinent to direct company administration, reducing the number and significance of independent princely states considerably from what had existed when he first arrived 8 years earlier. This expansion came, though, at a cost that would become fully apparent only in the following year, as accumulated grievances among displaced rulers, disrupted successions, and increasingly anxious sepoy soldiers combined with other sources of tension to produce a crisis that Dalhousie's confident vision of administrative progress had done little to anticipate or prepare for. Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, deprived of her adopted son's inheritance and her own position through a doctrine she had never accepted as legitimate, would emerge within a year of Dalhousie's departure as one of the most formidable and determined opponents company rule would ever face in open rebellion. Wajid Ali Shah's exile from Awadh and the resentment it fed among sepoys recruited from that province would similarly resurface with far greater consequence than Dalhousie's administrators had anticipated when they justified the annexation on grounds of misgovernment. The doctrine of lapse had expanded company territory efficiently and, from a narrowly administrative perspective, quite successfully. It had also, in the process, planted seeds of resentment across multiple regions and multiple classes of Indian society that would converge, with devastating consequence, in the great uprising now only months away. Chapter 13: The Rebellion of 1857. By early 1857, the accumulated grievances of the preceding decade had spread through the Bengal Army's sepoy ranks in ways that company officials, largely confident in the loyalty and discipline of forces they had built and trained over generations, remained slow to fully recognize. Soldiers who had watched Awadh annexed despite its ruler's loyalty, who had seen the doctrine of lapse dismiss customs they considered sacred, and who increasingly suspected that company rule harbored ambitions of religious conversion alongside territorial control, carried these anxieties into barracks across northern India. What was needed to ignite this accumulated tension into open rebellion was a specific, immediate grievance that soldiers could rally around directly. The introduction of a new rifle cartridge provided exactly that spark. The Enfield rifle, recently introduced into company service, required soldiers to bite open cartridges greased with a substance rumored, with considerable basis in fact, to contain both beef and pork fat. For Hindu soldiers, whose religious practice prohibited contact with beef, and for Muslim soldiers, whose faith forbade pork, this rumor struck at the deepest possible level of religious observance, suggesting either genuine indifference or, worse, deliberate intent on the company's part to defile soldiers regardless of their faith. Company officials, when confronted with these concerns, offered explanations and modifications that failed to fully dispel suspicions already primed by years of accumulated grievance over annexation, missionary activity, and administrative high-handedness. The cartridge became less a technical detail than a symbol of everything sepoys had come to fear about company intentions toward their religion and way of life. Mangal Pandey, a sepoy stationed at Barrackpore near Calcutta, became the rebellion's first widely remembered individual actor when he attacked his own officers in late March of 1857, wounding a sergeant major and an adjutant before being subdued and eventually executed by hanging in early April. His act alone did not trigger the broader uprising, since company authorities initially treated it as an isolated incident of individual defiance rather than the opening move of something larger. Pandey's execution and the disbanding of his regiment shortly afterward nonetheless circulated quickly through military channels connecting garrisons across northern India, feeding rather than extinguishing the tension already building around the cartridge controversy and its broader symbolic weight. The rebellion's true ignition came at Meerut in May of 1857, when 85 sepoys refused to accept the new cartridges and were court-martialed, stripped of their uniforms, and sentenced to lengthy imprisonment in a public ceremony designed to demonstrate company authority over any further resistance. The humiliation of this punishment, witnessed by fellow soldiers and by the local population, produced exactly the opposite effect company officials had intended. On the 10th of May, sepoy regiments at Meerut rose in open mutiny, freeing their imprisoned comrades, killing several British officers and civilians, and setting fire to company buildings before marching toward Delhi, roughly 40 miles distant, seeking a symbolic center around which broader rebellion might organize itself. Delhi's significance to the rebellion extended well beyond simple geographic proximity to Meerut, since the city still housed Bahadur Shah II, the aged and largely powerless Mughal emperor whose dynasty had once ruled the entirety of the territory the company now controlled. When mutinous sepoys arrived at Delhi and proclaimed Bahadur Shah as their sovereign leader, they transformed what had begun as a military mutiny over cartridges into something considerably broader, a rebellion that could draw on the symbolic legitimacy of restored Mughal authority to rally support beyond the army itself. Bahadur Shah, elderly and initially reluctant, accepted this role with limited enthusiasm, understanding perhaps better than his supporters the risks such symbolic leadership carried against an adversary as powerful as the company had become. News of Delhi's fall to rebel forces spread rapidly across northern India through May and June of 1857, triggering similar uprisings among sepoy garrisons in Kanpur, Lucknow, and numerous other stations where accumulated grievances found expression once the example of successful mutiny had been established elsewhere. Civilian populations in some regions joined the rebellion alongside mutinous soldiers, driven by their own grievances against company land revenue policies, disrupted local rulers, and broader resentment against foreign administration that extended well beyond the specific military concerns that had originally sparked the uprising. What company officials had initially dismissed as an isolated disciplinary problem had, within weeks, become a genuine and widespread challenge to British authority across a substantial portion of northern India. Kanpur produced some of the rebellion's most brutal episodes, where rebel forces under Nana Sahib, an adopted heir whose own succession claims the company had previously denied under principles similar to the doctrine of lapse, besieged the British garrison before eventually accepting its surrender under promises of safe passage that were subsequently violated. British men, women, and children who had surrendered were killed in circumstances that shocked British public opinion when news reached London, becoming a rallying point for demands of vengeance that would shape the brutal character of the rebellion's eventual suppression. The killings at Kanpur, whatever complex circumstances and mutual atrocities had preceded them, hardened British resolve toward a response that showed little mercy toward rebels or, frequently, toward Indian civilians only tangentially connected to the uprising itself. Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, whose adopted son's inheritance the doctrine of lapse had denied just 3 years earlier, emerged as one of the rebellion's most formidable military leaders. Once fighting reached her former territory, she organized and led defensive forces against company troops with a determination and tactical skill that impressed even her British adversaries, defending Jhansi through a prolonged siege before eventually being forced to abandon the city and continue resistance elsewhere. Her leadership and the personal grievance that had driven her toward rebellion made her among the most enduring symbols of the uprising in later Indian memory, a ruler who had lost her kingdom to legal technicality and who fought, ultimately at the cost of her own life, to reclaim what she considered rightfully her son's inheritance. Delhi's recapture became the company's central military priority through the summer of 1857, as British forces, reinforced by troops redirected from other campaigns and by loyal sepoy regiments that had not joined the rebellion, gathered outside the city walls to begin what became a prolonged and costly siege. Fighting through the summer heat proved exhausting and frequently inconclusive, with rebel forces inside the city defending their positions with considerable determination against besieging troops who suffered heavily from both combat casualties and disease. The siege finally broke in September, when British forces stormed the city after days of brutal house-to-house fighting that left much of Delhi devastated and its population subjected to reprisals that continued for weeks after organized rebel resistance had effectively collapsed. Bahadur Shah II, captured shortly after Delhi's fall, was tried by company authorities and exiled to Rangoon, where he would die in 1862, the last representative of a Mughal dynasty that had ruled significant portions of India for over 3 centuries, brought to an ignominious end in a foreign land, far from the seat of power his ancestors had once commanded. His sons were executed by a British officer who intercepted them during their attempted escape from the city, a killing that occurred outside any formal judicial process and that later became emblematic for critics of the rebellion's suppression of how thoroughly restraint had been abandoned in the pursuit of retribution against anyone associated with rebel leadership. Lucknow's siege ran roughly parallel to events at Delhi, with a British garrison and civilian population holding out against rebel forces for months before relief columns finally fought their way through to end the siege in late 1857. The fighting there proved similarly brutal, marked by heavy casualties on both sides and by conditions inside the besieged residency that grew increasingly desperate as supplies dwindled and disease spread among the trapped defenders. Lucknow's eventual relief became, alongside Delhi's recapture, one of the central narratives through which British accounts of the rebellion would later be told, emphasizing endurance and eventual triumph over an uprising portrayed, in most contemporary British writing, as unprovoked treachery rather than a response to genuine and accumulated grievance. Suppression of the rebellion, once British military advantage, became clear through the autumn and winter of 1857 into 1858, proceeded with a severity that shocked even some British observers sympathetic to the broader colonial project. Villages suspected of harboring rebels were burned, suspected mutineers were executed in large numbers, often without meaningful individual trial, and reprisals frequently extended well beyond anyone directly implicated in violence against British lives. Some British officers protested the scale and indiscriminate nature of this retribution, but such protests did little to slow a campaign of suppression driven substantially by the genuine horror many British officials and civilians felt over events at Campur and similar episodes elsewhere. Rani Lakshmibai died in June of 1858 during fighting near Gwalior, killed in combat while continuing to lead resistance forces even as the broader rebellion collapsed around her across most of northern India. Her death, occurring on horseback according to most accounts, cemented her status as perhaps the rebellion's most celebrated figure in later Indian nationalist memory, remembered as a ruler who chose armed resistance over accepting the loss of her kingdom without a fight. By the time of her death, organized rebel resistance had largely been extinguished across the territories where it had once flourished so dramatically just a year earlier, though scattered fighting and localized resistance would continue in some regions for months afterward. The rebellion's ultimate cost, measured in lives lost among soldiers and civilians on both sides, ran into the hundreds of thousands, a toll that included not only combat casualties, but the civilian populations caught in reprisals, famine, and disease that accompanied months of warfare across densely populated regions of northern India. What had begun as a mutiny over greased cartridges had grown into the most serious armed challenge to company rule in its entire history, drawing together sepoy grievances, dispossessed rulers, and civilian discontent into a rebellion that, however ultimately unsuccessful in restoring the old order, permanently altered how both Indians and the British understood the nature and limits of company authority over the subcontinent it had spent 2.5 centuries acquiring. Chapter 14: The Crown Takes Over. News of the rebellion's scale and brutality reached London through the summer and autumn of 1857, arriving in a form that shocked British public opinion and forced a reckoning with questions about company governance that had simmered for decades without producing decisive reform. Parliament, already home to critics who had long questioned whether a commercial organization was fit to govern a subcontinent, found in the rebellion overwhelming justification for arguments that had previously struggled to gain sufficient political traction. The uprising had demonstrated in the starkest possible terms that company rule rested on foundations considerably less stable than its administrators had assumed, and that the accumulated grievances of a century of conquest and annexation could erupt into violence, threatening the entire British position in India. Debate in Parliament through late 1857 and into 1858 centered less on whether company rule should end than on precisely how the transition to direct crown authority should be structured and implemented. Few voices in either the Commons or the Lords argued seriously for preserving company governance in anything resembling its existing form, given how thoroughly the rebellion had exposed its failures of both administration and, in the eyes of many critics, moral legitimacy. Lord Palmerston's government introduced legislation aimed at formally transferring Indian governance from the company to the Crown, a measure that moved through Parliament with relatively broad support despite disagreements over specific details of the new administrative structure being proposed. The Government of India Act, passed in August of 1858, formally ended over 2.5 centuries of company rule and transferred all territories, revenues, and administrative responsibilities directly to the British Crown. This was not, in practical terms, a revolutionary reorganization of how India would actually be governed day to day, since much of the existing administrative apparatus, including the civil service trained at Haileybury and the vast network of Indian officials beneath it, continued functioning largely unchanged under new nominal authority. What changed most significantly was the formal chain of accountability, which now ran directly to a Secretary of State for India answerable to Parliament, rather than to company directors answerable primarily to shareholders. Queen Victoria's proclamation announcing this transfer of authority, issued in November of 1858, struck a deliberately different tone from much of the company's own historical conduct, promising respect for Indian religious practices, property rights, and existing social customs in language clearly intended to address the grievances that had helped fuel the rebellion. The proclamation renounced any intention of imposing British religious beliefs on Indian subjects, a direct response to fears about forced conversion that had circulated so damagingly around the cartridge controversy. It also promised that Indians would be considered eligible for government service based on qualification and merit, rather than being systematically excluded on grounds of race, though the practical implementation of this promise would fall considerably short of its stated ideals for decades to come. Governor-Generals now carried the additional title of Viceroy, a change that reflected the more explicitly monarchical character the new administration wished to project, positioning the Crown's representative in India as something closer to a royal deputy than a company executive. Lord Canning, who had presided over the rebellion's suppression as the company's final Governor-General, became the first viceroy under this new arrangement, tasked with managing the delicate transition from company to crown authority, while also addressing the practical work of reconstruction across regions devastated by over a year of warfare. His tenure bridged both eras directly, giving him a perspective on the transition that few other officials could claim. The company itself did not disappear immediately upon passage of the Government of India Act, continuing to exist as a legal entity for several more years, even as its actual governing authority had been stripped away entirely. Its remaining shareholders received compensation from the British government for the loss of their governing rights, a settlement that effectively closed out the commercial dimension of an organization whose profits had, for generations, been inseparable from its exercise of political and military power over Indian territory. The formal dissolution of the company as a corporate entity would not occur until 1874, when its charter was finally allowed to lapse entirely, bringing to a quiet legal conclusion an institution whose practical governing role had already ended 16 years earlier. What the transfer to crown rule did not fundamentally alter, despite the rhetorical emphasis on new beginnings and renewed respect for Indian institutions, was the underlying structure of British extraction and control that the company had spent 2 centuries building across the subcontinent. Land revenue systems established under company administration continued largely unchanged under Crown authority, still drawing the majority of government income from taxation on Indian agriculture, regardless of which institution technically held ultimate authority over collection. The civil service, trained through mechanisms company administrators had established, continued recruiting and operating along lines that differed from company practice, primarily in formal title rather than substantive character. Military reorganization following the rebellion proved more genuinely consequential than most other changes accompanying the transition to Crown rule, reflecting lessons drawn directly from how thoroughly sepoy discontent had fueled the uprising. The ratio of British to Indian soldiers within the army was substantially increased, reversing the previous heavy reliance on Indian troops that had made the rebellion possible in the first place. Recruitment patterns shifted as well, drawing more heavily on communities British officials judged more reliably loyal, while artillery units, previously staffed significantly by Indian soldiers, became almost exclusively British in composition going forward. These changes reflected a colonial administration considerably more anxious about the loyalty of the forces it depended upon than the company had generally displayed before 1857. Princely states that had remained loyal during the rebellion, or that had simply avoided active participation in the uprising, found their position under Crown rule considerably more secure than it had been under Dalhousie's aggressive annexation policies of the preceding decade. The doctrine of lapse was formally abandoned as Crown policy, and princely rulers were guaranteed the right to adopt heirs according to their own traditional practices, a reversal that acknowledged, at least implicitly, how much resentment Dalhousie's approach had generated among precisely the class of rulers whose cooperation the new administration now wished to secure. This shift produced a somewhat more stable, if still fundamentally unequal, relationship between Crown authority and the substantial portion of Indian territory that remained under princely rather than direct British administration. British public and official memory of the rebellion, shaped considerably by the atrocities at Kanpur and by broader anxieties about the loyalty of colonial subjects more generally, hardened attitudes toward Indian society in ways that would influence colonial policy for decades following the transition to Crown rule. Racial theories that had circulated with varying degrees of prominence before 1857 gained new currency and official sanction in its aftermath, providing intellectual justification for policies of segregation and exclusion that grew more pronounced under Crown administration than they had generally been under company rule. Social distance between British administrators and Indian subjects increased measurably in the decades following the rebellion, reflected in everything from residential patterns in colonial cities to the informal barriers that increasingly limited genuine social interaction between rulers and ruled. For Indians who had participated in or supported the rebellion, the aftermath brought continued hardship well beyond the immediate military suppression, as confiscated lands damaged livelihoods and disrupted communities took years to recover from the widespread destruction the conflict had produced across substantial portions of northern India. Company and later Crown authorities showed limited interest in addressing the underlying economic and social grievances that had contributed to rebellion in the first place, focusing instead on military reorganization and administrative restructuring that addressed institutional vulnerabilities without meaningfully confronting the deeper resentments the uprising had exposed. This pattern of incomplete reckoning would leave many of the tensions that had fueled 1857 essentially unresolved, simply submerged beneath a period of relative stability that Crown Rule's early decades managed to establish. What the events of 1857 and 1858 ultimately represented, considered together, was less a genuine transformation of British India's fundamental character than a change in the formal institution through which essentially continuous policies of extraction and control would be administered going forward. The company had built the administrative, military, and revenue systems that would continue operating largely intact under Crown authority for the following 90 years until Indian independence finally arrived in 1947. Its most consequential legacy was not any single policy or institution, but the entire framework of governance itself, developed piecemeal across 2.5 centuries of trade, conquest, and administration, that the Crown now inherited essentially whole and would continue operating according to principles the company had first established. Lord Canning, reflecting on the transition he had overseen in correspondence written during these years, expressed genuine hope that Crown Rule might address some of the failures that had contributed to rebellion, while also acknowledging the practical difficulty of transforming deeply entrenched administrative habits simply by changing the institution nominally responsible for them. His own tenure as the first viceroy would be remembered primarily for managing this delicate transition competently, rather than for any dramatic new departure in policy, a fitting enough legacy for an official whose main achievement lay in ensuring continuity through a moment when institutional collapse had seemed genuinely possible. The company that had begun as a modest venture of London merchants seeking pepper had, by the moment of its formal political demise, bequeathed to the Crown an empire whose scale and complexity none of those original 218 subscribers could possibly have imagined. What remained ahead for both the Crown administration, now formally responsible for India, and for the company still existing as a legal entity awaiting final dissolution, was the slow work of determining exactly what would survive from 2.5 centuries of company rule, and what, if anything, might yet be reformed or reconsidered in the decades of Crown governance still to come. That reckoning would extend across generations, shaped by voices both British and Indian, who continued debating the company's legacy long after its final charter had lapsed and its name had passed from active governance into historical memory alone. The history ends, formally in an office in London in 1874, when a charter nobody bothered to renew was simply allowed to expire. No ceremony marked it. No newspaper thought it worth much space. The company that had once commanded armies larger than most kingdoms, that had decided who ruled Bengal and who did not, that had fought a war over a drug most of its own directors never touched themselves, went out not with defeat but with a shrug, a clerk's signature on a document nobody read twice. There is something worth sitting with in that quiet ending, a stillness that has nothing to do with the noise the company made getting there. 218 merchants once pooled their money on a gamble about pepper, never imagining what that gamble would grow into. They could not have imagined Plassey or Bengal's fields gone empty in a famine nobody in London much hurried to relieve, or a Nawab's widow riding into her last battle rather than accept what a legal doctrine had decided about her son. They could not have imagined a young clerk named Clive arriving nervous and unremarkable, or an old emperor dying in exile in Rangoon, further from home than any of his ancestors had ever been. What a company becomes when nobody stops it soon enough is a question this history keeps circling without ever fully answering. It is worth thinking about the ordinary mechanics of it all: ledgers, shipping manifests, a director's signature on a loan, a young man's transfer from a writing desk to a rifle. Empires, when you get close enough, are rarely built by anyone who set out to build one. They accumulate, decision by small decision, until one day someone looks up and finds a continent has changed hands. Somewhere in Gujarat tonight, cotton still grows in fields that once fed the looms of a trade nobody living remembers negotiating. Somewhere near the Bhagirathi River, the ground at Plassey has long since gone back to grass and cultivation, indistinguishable now from any other quiet stretch of Bengal countryside. Rivers keep moving the way they always have, indifferent to which flag happened to fly over their banks in any given century. There is a kind of mercy in that indifference, if you choose to see it that way. Consider, if you're still awake to consider anything, how much of history is simply this: people doing small, understandable things for reasons that made sense to them at the time, until the sum of those small things becomes larger than any one person could have intended or controlled. A merchant wanting a fair price for pepper, a clerk wanting to prove himself capable of something more than bookkeeping, a frightened emperor accepting a crown he never asked to wear because refusing seemed more dangerous than accepting. None of them were thinking in the moment about the shape of the 200 years that would follow. The fields Robert Clive once fought over produce rice again now, indifferent to old ledgers. The building that once housed company headquarters in London is gone, replaced by something else entirely, the kind of ordinary architectural churn that swallows even the largest institutions eventually. Seringapatam's walls, breached in 1799, have weathered slowly back towards stone and moss, and the patient work of monsoon rain returning everything, eventually, to something closer to what it was before anyone thought to build a fort there at all. If you drift towards sleep now, let it be with the ordinary weight of that thought, that even the largest things pass, that a company which once ruled tens of millions of people is now mostly a chapter in books nobody but historians read closely, that whatever seems immovable in your own life tonight is, in its own smaller way, just as temporary as a charter nobody thought worth renewing. Rest easy in that. Somewhere a river keeps moving. Somewhere a field lies quiet under a sky that has outlasted every empire that ever claimed to own it.